There are chapters of human history we never had the chance to write down. When the ground still trembled under the weight of a melting ice age, and when shorelines stretched hundreds of kilometers beyond where we stand today, those ancient memories quietly slipped beneath the ocean, never returning in full. Long before Harappa or Mohenjo-Daro rose with no clear beginning, the Indian subcontinent was the backdrop for a much deeper story, one that survives only through scattered shards of pottery, a few lines scratched into stone, and old legends passed down like echoes of something that once existed and then vanished. When sea levels were 120 meters lower, the rivers we now call ancient were no more than young waters feeling their way toward the ocean. Along the once endless coasts of Gujarat and across the wide plain that the Bay of Bengal used to be, now nothing more than sea floor blurred beneath layers of silt. There may have been communities whose memory survives only faintly in the Rig Veda and the Purana. They lived, they moved, they watched the sky, they carved their world in ways modern science still struggles to fully understand. Then, around 12,900 years before the Common Era, powerful surges of rising water swept across everything, erasing entire coastlines and leaving behind a thick veil we are still trying to see through. It is on that fragile boundary between what we know and what remains submerged that the story of India before the Great Flood begins to take shape. Not clearly, not decisively, but enough for us to feel the outline of an age that disappeared like the first touch of dawn on the sea. Dim, distant, yet impossible to ignore. And now you are here, with historical storytell, stepping down into the layers of earth, where the silent ground still holds the earliest memories of humankind. Just enough for us to recognize, and enough to sense that what remains is only the thinnest surface of a story stretching far beyond human memory. From the quiet moment that closed the introduction, the journey back into South Asia's deep prehistory opens like a road without markers, guided only by scattered traces time forgot. When we return to the period around 20,000 years before the present, during the last glacial maximum, we find a subcontinent with a face utterly unlike today. Colder, wider, wind drier, yet pulsing with a raw, early kind of life. The Himalayas still towered, but everything to their south spread out into a vast, borderless expanse. Grasslands flowed into semi-arid plains, which softened into open forests, all woven into a flexible landscape where people could move with the seasons. In valleys far from rainfall, young streams appeared without warning, small, shallow, unnamed, yet strong enough to carve natural corridors for wildlife and for the earliest human groups finding their way into this land. When archaeologists stepped into Bhimbetka, beneath rock shelters stained by time, they found paintings still alive with the energy of ancient hands, dancers, chasing animals, repeating geometric patterns. These images speak of what stone tools cannot. The people here observe the world with sharp eyes and fertile imagination. They recorded the movements of earth and sky, not just to remember, but to interpret life through a language entirely their own. In the dim light of these shelters, South Asia appears not as a fringe of civilization, but as one of the earliest places where symbolic thought took root. Going further back, Jwalapuram tells a different story. Thick layers of ash from the Toba eruption 74,000 years ago lie over stone tools, showing that humans survived one of the most violent natural events on Earth. They stayed, even when the sky must have remained dark for years. A community able to endure such a catastrophe wasn't only resilient, it suggests the subcontinent was once a natural refuge, a place capable of holding on to life while the world outside reeled. Traces from the ancient Krishna Godavari region hint at something else. These people did not wander aimlessly. The density of artifacts shows they returned to the same places again and again, perhaps over hundreds of generations. Layered hearths, worn fire pits, and clusters of stone flakes reveal a very early form of semi-settled life. They had not yet built villages, but they no longer drifted endlessly. A rhythm of repeated temporary dwelling had emerged, a crucial step toward permanent settlement. Along the southern coast, tiny stone fragments and fossilized hearths reveal that humans reached Tamil Nadu and Kerala 50 to 70,000 years ago. Sparse though these traces are, they hint at how people once watched the monsoon, tracked animals, read the weather in the color of leaves, and relied on stable climate cycles to shape their survival. This knowledge needed no writing. It passed through hands, glances, and the simple instructions elders gave to children. Where the water will rise when the rain comes. While other parts of the world lay beneath deep ice, South Asia held on to a more temperate climate, becoming a rare kind of refuge, a network of forests, grasslands, and rivers rich enough for humans to roam widely and still return without fear of losing their lifeline. Perhaps this is why many scholars believe the subcontinent was not merely a stopover for migrating groups from Africa, but may have been one of humanity's stable homelands long before agriculture. And standing in the present, looking back toward a land where unnamed waters once flowed in the dark of prehistory, a quiet question begins to rise. Could these patient, enduring communities have planted the very first seeds on the long path to civilization, even if they never knew that every step they took was opening a story that would continue all the way to us today? That lingering question from the previous part seems to echo through the ancient ground beneath our feet, leading us into an age when the world reshaped itself layer by layer, like a painting slowly cleared of the cold mist gathered over millennia. From 20,000 to 12,000 years before the present, Earth moved through one of the greatest seasonal shifts in natural history. Ice melted, climates shifted rhythm, and the boundary between land and sea blurred, sharpened, and blurred again, all following the long exhale of a planet, waking from an extended winter. There was no clear beginning, only quiet thousands of years, powerful enough to redraw entire maps. Far to the north, the ice sheets that once blocked human movement began to retreat. Meltwater poured into valleys, filling natural basins and turning small trickles into strong currents. At the foot of the Himalayas, glaciers pulled back to reveal wide, unexpected stream beds and fresh layers of fertile silt, transforming the northern subcontinent into a thriving belt ready for life to expand. Along the coasts, change came constantly, not violent, but persistent. Flat shores became lagoons, dry stretches turned into river mouths, ancient dunes collapsed and rebuilt themselves under wind and water. Geological surveys show that Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu once stretched far beyond today's shoreline. The only remnants are deep sediment beds and compressed shells buried under marine sand. The rising sea may have been slow, but it was enough to force people to adjust how they lived, traveled, and read the signals of nature. Yet the most striking story is not about losing land. It is about how people recorded these shifts. Hearths and stone tools buried under thin layers of silt show that they returned to familiar sites again and again, even as the landscape changed around them. They did not depend on a single place. They anchored themselves to patterns more reliable than any coastline. The season fish would run, the moment water would retreat, the turning of the wind. That flexibility allowed them to survive in a world changing a little more each year. The Gulf of Cambay, home to underwater structures debated for decades, reminds us how dramatic those changes once were. Aligned stone blocks, polished shards of pottery, and ancient surfaces found at unusual depths hint at repeated rises and falls of sea levels. Science remains cautious, but even the existence of these shapes suggests that old memories of shifting land and water were not imagined. They echo events witnessed across many generations. In the East, the Bengal lowlands underwent an even more dramatic rebirth. The Ganga and the Brahmaputra, the subcontinent's two great water arteries, only reached their present forms after massive glacial lake bursts in the far north. Before that, the Bengal coast may have been a quiet, flat plain. Once the water came down, that plain became a broad estuary, then a colossal delta, of which we now see only the portion still above sea level. Stories of the sea eating the land, of sandbars vanishing, of families forced to leave their homes are not unique to South Asia. Iran, Mesopotamia, and Southeast Asia all tell similar tales. This shared memory shows that environmental change touched people's imagination very early, traveling from generation to generation like a common archive of the age. Amid this shifting geography, the inhabitants of the subcontinent showed remarkable adaptability. Coastal communities brought with them knowledge of tidal rhythms, fish seasons, and ocean winds. Upland groups contributed insights from rivers and plains. Layer by layer, skills from many landscapes blended into a new body of understanding, flexible, deep, and practical. No script preserved this wisdom, yet these very ideas later became the soul of the Indus civilization, where water management reached an unmatched level of precision. Looking back, the greatest transformation of the melting age was not in coastlines or riverbeds, but in memory itself. People left old places, but the habits they carried survived for thousands of years. How to build homes above water lines, how to read the sky for changes in weather, how to explain natural events in stories told to children. These memories no longer belong to their original landscapes. They became the foundation of a new world, the post-glacial world, where stability had to be rebuilt from experience. And it was at the moment when the last ice released its warmth, opening a planet softer, yet harder to predict, that our story shifts into a new rhythm. The era when young rivers would reshape the cradle of South Asian civilization, and human society would take its earliest steps toward organization. From the shorelines that once stretched far beyond today's coast and the lands now lost beneath ancient seas, our journey moves deep into the heart of the subcontinent, where post-Ice Age rivers, still young and restless, were quietly reshaping the landscape. As mountain ice retreated, climates warmed, and sea levels steadied, South Asia entered what many researchers describe as a quiet rebirth. No citadels, no temples, only new currents preparing the ground for human history. Among these rivers, one name rises from the verses of the Rig Veda, Sarasvati. In the ancient hymns, it appears as a mighty, radiant waterway, nourishing people, teaching them the order of the world, and serving as a source of spiritual intuition. For a long time, some believed it was only a poetic symbol. Yet modern geology reveals the path of an ancient river running from the Himalayas through Haryana and Rajasthan before opening into a broad estuary. As the climate dried, the river shifted course, leaving behind the abandoned channel now called the Ghaggar Hakra. No one can say with certainty that this was the Saraswati of the Rig Veda, but the memory of a great river left a mark too deep on the communities here to be dismissed as imagination. Findings from Burana, Kunal, and Farmana uncover something even more revealing. In their deepest layers, early wheat grains, coarse pottery, and refined stone tools appear at dates far older than the height of the Indus civilization. This suggests that the northwest of India had a stable network of communities long before cities existed. Not urban settlements, but calm seasonal clusters where people stayed close to the water even when the river was unpredictable. They watched it shift, learned its habits, and returned often enough that a quiet attachment to the land began to form. Compared with other regions of the world, South Asia followed a very different path. In Mesopotamia or Egypt, people settled only once the rivers had clear, reliable cycles. Here, the opposite happened. People built homes near rivers still young, still changing shape every few decades. That demanded an unusual sensitivity to the natural world, reading the wind, knowing the clouds that promised rain, watching the color of water before storms, and sensing the moment fish would rise. Layered across generations, this experience became the earliest foundation of Vedic thought, where the idea of order was understood through the rhythm of seasons and the cycles of nature. The concept of Urta, the cosmic order, may have grown from that intimate awareness of sun and rain. Agni, the sacred fire, echoes the hearth flames that marked time in the night. Even the idea of cycles, which became central to Indian philosophy, may have begun with the way these early communities watched rivers change form and return again year after year. Mehrgarh, around 7,000 years before the present, stands as the clearest proof of this resilience. In a land bridging the Iranian plateau and the Indus plains, its people domesticated local wheat, raised zebu cattle, and stored grain, not through knowledge brought from afar, but through patient, local observation. As they marked out fields, built small storage houses, and crafted beads with symbolic value, they unintentionally laid the first structural stones for the social organization that would later flourish into Harappa. These communities were not large, but they were steady. The ancient soil layers reveal clear rhythms, building near the water, avoiding low ground, moving with the seasons. Over time, memory of the environment became cultural memory. What they learned about rivers did more than help them live. It shaped how they thought, how they forecasted seasons, how they arranged their spaces. If we see the young post-glacial rivers as living beings, then they, more than stone fragments or hearth ash, were the axis on which South Asian civilization would turn. They were the memory of the land, the link between people and climate, the place where the most important knowledge was created through thousands of years of careful watching. India at that time had no cities, no towers, no writing, yet it held three rhythms that never faltered: the rhythm of water, the rhythm of sky, and the rhythm of memory. And from those rhythms, the Indus civilization would awaken, like a river reaching fullness, carrying with it all the experiences of generations who lived and listened to the land. From the young post-Ice Age rivers carving new paths across the land, the story leads us toward the shifting boundary between earth and sea, a place where the rise and fall of water did more than redraw coastlines. It carried memories far older than any surviving record. As the subcontinent settled into a gentler climate, much of its earliest history slipped beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean, leaving only a faint echo behind. In the deep south of the peninsula, where Tamil Nadu and Kerala now meet the shoreline, the land once stretched far beyond the modern coast. Geological data shows a vast coastal plain existed there, braided with ancient branches of the Kaveri. Within Dravidian tradition, the story of Kumari Kandam, a land swallowed by the sea, preserves a dim memory of a world now missing. Though science remains cautious, it is difficult to shake the feeling that this myth holds the imprint of something real, though incomplete. Off the coast near Kanyakumari, flat terraces of stone, straight edges, and layers of ancient sediment still puzzle researchers. There is not enough evidence to claim they were built by early humans, yet their symmetry makes it equally hard to dismiss them as entirely natural. If people once lived there, coastal hunters, seasonal migrants, or semi-settled groups, what remains now are the faintest fragments. The ashes of a fire pit, a shard of pottery worn smooth by water, a footprint once pressed into earth that later slipped beneath the rising sea. Farther west, the Gulf of Cambay remains one of South Asia's enduring mysteries. Structures deep below the water, aligned, geometric, almost like foundations, have stirred debate for decades. They are regular enough to suggest human hands, but not proven enough to rewrite history. If they truly belonged to an ancient settlement, it would mean a community stood here more than 9,000 years ago, when sea levels were far lower. Even with scientific caution, their presence alone raises a much larger question. How much of South Asia's early story rests underwater? And will we ever reach it again? Yet the more meaningful traces lie not on the seafloor, but in the memory carried through culture. In Vedic hymns and Dravidian lore alike, water is always dual in nature. It sustains, and it erases. It blesses, and it wipes away human presence. Tales of great floods, of land eaten by the sea, of groups forced inland, recur across traditions, from the Rig Veda and the Puranas to the oral stories of forest tribes. No single group kept the whole story, but each preserved a piece. As the shoreline advanced inland, the coastal people retreated. They carried with them a world of knowledge, how to read wind, measure tides, follow fish migrations. And when this knowledge mingled with that of mountain and riverine communities, South Asia developed an unusually layered cultural foundation. It is why so many traditions across the region feel both nomadic and ocean-marked. Two worlds that seem separate, yet have been intertwined since antiquity. Memory of drowned lands lingers even in language. Certain Dravidian terms connected to the sea are believed to date back to a time when people lived mere steps from the water, before the ancient shore vanished. Language, the one thing the sea cannot wash away, became the most enduring remnant of those lost landscapes. By the early Holocene, as the climate softened and monsoons steadied, Memory of submerged lands transformed into epics and symbols. Water became more than a hazard. It became the boundary between what can be remembered and what has slipped beyond reach. Rivers symbolized life, while the sea became a metaphor for everything that escapes human grasp. Communities pushed inland began to build more permanent homes, forming stable clusters, the first seeds of organized society. From those new gathering points, a different story began to unfold. No one knew what had been lost beneath the waves. They only knew what remained, and that it had to be rebuilt. And in the quiet struggle to continue after such unpredictable changes, the earliest foundations of the Indus civilization took shape, as if the footsteps of those ancient coastal people still echoed beneath the water, guiding later generations through a world transforming once again. Moving inland from the settlements that emerged after the rise of the sea, we encounter the moment when human life shifted from restless footsteps to a new state of being. People paused, studied the ground, and for the first time sensed that they might truly belong to a place. It was not a sudden breakthrough, but an awareness that ripened through countless small observations. Seeds sprouting at the right season, soil softening after the waters receded, wild grasses becoming food during dry months. These quiet realizations gathered into a new intuition. Nature could be tended, and if cared for, it would answer back. In this slowly forming landscape, Mehrgarh rose as a steadfast anchor on the western edge. Not a city, and certainly not a sacred center, Mehrgarh felt more like a laboratory stretching across millennia. From around 7,000 before the Common Era, its people stayed loyal to the fertile ground beneath their feet. They cultivated native wheat, domesticated zebu cattle, stored seeds, and experimented with early forms of production. Persistence was their greatest tool. Each planting season added to a growing understanding of climate, wind, water, and soil, knowledge that would eventually form the base of permanent settlement. At the same time, along the Indus, the Sarasvati, and the young branches of the Ganga, small groups of foragers began their own gradual shifts. They dug pits for grain storage, built windbreaks from mud and straw, and arranged their homes to catch or avoid the sun depending on the season. Tiny ornaments made from bone, soft stone, and shell began appearing in young burials, signs that objects had started carrying meaning beyond simple use. A single bead placed beside a body revealed something new. Humans were beginning to imagine life that stretched beyond their years. The greatest change did not lie in tools, but in how people saw the land. For nomads, land was a stop along the way. For settled communities, it became a place to return to. From this came a sense of the future, saving seeds for the next season, marking territory, building wind barriers, leaving signs for those who would follow. Tradition began this way, not through writing, but through repeated actions that slowly solidified into shared habit. Everything unfolded at a slow pace, without any dramatic revolution. But it was precisely this slowness that allowed small changes to accumulate into a turning point. When the people of Mehrgarh crafted beads from lapis lazuli, a deep blue stone from faraway Afghanistan, it was more than evidence of trade. It suggested a desire to connect distant lands through a single color, as if carrying a piece of another sky against their chest. Alongside material needs, early ritual impulses also surfaced. Some children's graves held necklaces, as if the living wished to send them off with something meaningful. a gesture echoing the idea that death did not erase everything. This quiet belief would later echo through Vedic texts in more refined form. Ideas about ancestors, spirit, and the bridge between life and loss began with simple acts like these. Across the Indus Plain, small clusters of houses at Remanderi or Sheri Khan Tarakai gradually grew closer together, hinting at rising social cohesion. From these modest settlements, a thin yet resilient cultural thread spread along the Indus, the river that would one day cradle one of the most radiant civilizations of the ancient world. What invites reflection is how creation and loss moved in parallel. While people built homes, planted crops, and claimed land, the ancient coast continued to slip beneath the water. One place was being settled while another vanished. In their lived experience, earth and water were always exchanging roles. When the sea claimed land, the land gave rise to something new. Perhaps this is why, in early Indian tradition, the two elements became inseparable layers of identity: earth as the place we belong to, and water as the realm of what has passed beyond reach. As these communities grew more stable, better pottery, stronger walls, clearer organization of living space, a moment of transformation arrived. The first seeds, both literal and symbolic, began to unfold into the early shoots of a more complex society, laying the groundwork for the rise of the Indus civilization. From the early shoots of settlement, the story opens into a web of footpaths cutting across valleys, grasslands, and the edges of desert, the first channels of contact that made the world feel wider to prehistoric communities. Once people stopped traveling solely to survive and began visiting distant places out of curiosity, a new rhythm emerged, steady, familiar, like the long breath of a society growing up after the ice. At Mehrgarh, the arrival of lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone found only in Badakhshan, is one of the earliest signs that communication routes had existed for a long time. No one knows how many mountains the stone crossed before reaching the hands of an ancient craftsperson, but its presence makes something unmistakably clear. This small community had already opened its gaze to a wider world, drawn to the beauty carried from a distant sky. Around the same period, stone tools from Rajasthan appear in western Pakistan. Makran shells show up deep inland, and axes of the same style surface in settlements hundreds of kilometers apart. These are not trade networks in the later sense, but they reveal a fragile yet far-reaching system of exchange, nameless, without borders, fueled by curiosity and the willingness to share objects too beautiful to keep for oneself. To the east, small clusters of settlement along the Ganga plain began finding stability. They were not yet cultivating wet rice, but they had domesticated local plants, refined ground-stone tools, and left open areas that seemed to serve as seasonal gathering spots. Every meeting between groups became an opportunity for knowledge to spread, not through writing, but through shared speech and craftsmanship. Farther south, people living near the ancient mouth of the Kaveri River moved between two rhythms: fishing and foraging. When they met groups from the interior, they discovered the value of exchange. Early coarse pottery appears here, possibly learned from the Northwest, or simply emerging from a life becoming more stable and needing more durable vessels. The deepest shift of this era lies in how people sensed distance. For nomads, distance was a barrier. For settling communities, it became something to organize. They marked routes to places with good stone, fine clay, or large shells. These paths were not roads, only strips of open ground between two lines of trees. But they marked a critical turning point. The idea of connection had taken shape. When we overlay these early pathways on reconstructed maps, they unintentionally weave different cultural zones together with soft but resilient threads. Where paths crossed, small residential clusters formed, tiny centers where stories were exchanged, techniques imitated, and knowledge passed along. This is how knowledge traveled before writing, through footsteps, through firelight, through objects passed from one hand to another. Imagine a stone worker from Mehrgar carrying a newly fashioned axe to a group near the Indus, trading it for Makran shells. When he returned home, he brought not only the shells, but stories about the people who lived by the sea, how they read the tides, how they built roofs against salt winds. Meanwhile, coastal dwellers carried back tales of deep blue stones from mountains they had never seen. These small, persistent stories expanded the mental world of each generation. The idea that there are many places beyond this one became a seed of imagination, prompting people to think about community on a larger scale, beyond a handful of families living side by side. As exchange became familiar, the early footpaths were used year-round. Small settlements grew. A few dozen people became a few hundred, then a few thousand. Social roles began to differentiate. Guides, potters, quipos of roots, storehouse managers, negotiators with distant groups. No one noticed the exact moment of transition, but all the ingredients for urban life, exchange, specialization, stability, memory, were already in place. And before true cities emerged, it helps to remember something simple. Every city begins with a single footprint on a dirt path, a chance meeting between strangers, a small gift of stone or shell. It was these soft threads that opened the way toward the Indus civilization. A brilliant chapter humanity would one day look back on with wonder. From the tightening web of footpaths and the quick meetings that slowly became habit, the story moves into a phase where small settlements begin to outgrow the idea of shelter. They turn into gathering points, places where people pool experience, labor, and memory to create a kind of organization the world had never seen before. There are no walls, no temples, no fired bricks, yet these early centers carry something more important, a shared rhythm steady enough to form collective memory. In the Northwest, Raimanderi and Sherry Khan Tarakai show communities moving beyond simply sharing land. Houses rise close to one another with deliberate orientation, as if the people had started thinking of the village as a living whole that needed care. In Middle Phase Mehrgar, tightly packed mud brick walls and clearly partitioned floors reflect a new awareness. Living space is an extension of the community, something that must hold order if it's meant to last. Some sites reveal communal refuse pits, a small detail that speaks volumes. They show a desire for cleanliness, a wish to avoid conflict, and a shared understanding of how to deal with what is discarded. These quiet agreements are the earliest sketch of customary law, rules unwritten but strong enough to maintain harmony. Small production zones reinforce this shift. Clusters of stone tools, firing spots, and grouped pottery shards hint at early job specialization. Power structures do not exist yet, but a web of interdependence is clearly taking shape, one that helps a community stay steady when climate or landscape changes. Across the humid Ganga plain, organization takes on different materials, but the same spirit. Bamboo houses, raised platforms to escape floods, shared open areas for drying grain or gathering during seasonal cycles. Despite the contrast in environment, people in both regions treat their living space as a continuation of community memory. Tiny granaries near communal areas reveal the urge to store, share, and plan. And with that comes a quiet question. Who keeps the grain? Who distributes it? Who decides? Even if settled through spoken agreement, their very existence hints that community management has grown beyond instinct. In many places, wooden stakes or thorn bushes mark boundaries between living areas and grazing fields. They are not defensive structures, only ways to prevent disorder. But once people begin caring about boundaries, they begin caring about structure, the earliest sign of ownership and responsibility. Meanwhile, a subtle spiritual transformation unfolds in small terracotta figurines, beads, animal miniatures, and circular tokens. They may not belong to major rituals, but they echo a need to place emotion, hope, and meaning into material form. This is the seed of symbolic thinking, the bridge between the visible world and inner life. As more settlements along the Indus and Sarasvati link into broader networks, the idea of a center emerges, a place with more exchange, more activity, more people. These centers do not grow from ambition, but from long, steady rhythms, places where life simply accumulates until the location develops a natural cultural gravity. The people of that era likely never knew they were contributing to a larger transformation. Each person simply did what was familiar, sowing seeds, firing pottery, gathering clay, fixing a roof before the rains. Yet it is this persistent repetition across generations that weaves true change. History is not always born from great individuals. More often, it rises from countless quiet details, steady and anonymous. And then, at some point, these settlements grow beyond the scale of villages. Stability gathers into strength. Shared memory becomes a binding force. People do not just live beside one another. They begin living with one another, carrying a shared sense of identity. This is the first moment of urban life, when organization, common rhythms, and collective memory converge, preparing the ground for a civilization that will soon shine brilliantly. The Indus. From the early centers, expanding with the rhythm of the seasons, the story moves into a phase where settlements begin to stretch beyond the form of villages and drift toward becoming towns. There is no single moment marking the shift. Every step forward grows from tiny choices, adding another wall, reshaping a kiln, enlarging a storage pit, or simply deciding to stay on a piece of land that once was only a rest stop between seasons. Across the ancient Indus and Saraswati corridors, settlements carry more signs of organization. Remanderi, around 4,500 to 4,000. Before the Common Era is a striking example. Dirt paths run straight, houses align in a calm, intentional rhythm. Open areas between clusters become natural gathering spots. No one knows who designed these lines and grids, yet their presence shows that people had begun imagining their home as a whole rather than a scatter of huts. Sun-dried mud brick becomes the everyday material. Though rough, the bricks are surprisingly uniform, hinting at a quiet standardization. It reflects a mindset of efficiency, easier to build, easier to replace, easier to teach. A kind of soft discipline takes root, not by decree, but by habit. Large kilns appear in several emerging towns, marking the rise of pottery as both craft and expression. Household items begin to carry beauty. Wave motifs, circles, diagonal lines. The town's collective voice etched into everyday objects. Symbolic thinking, once fragile in tiny figurines and beadwork, now flows naturally into common life. As empty patches between homes turn into exchange spaces, towns develop an early marketplace rhythm. At Amri and Kot Diji, archaeologists uncover stones from Baluchistan, shells from Makran, pottery from Punjab, and beads from distant regions. Every object passes through many hands, carrying stories that move knowledge along invisible routes between communities. With expanding crafts comes clearer division of labor. Some areas specialize in weaving, others show copper and tin slag, early signs of metal work, and still others housework shops for ornament making. There are no grand houses or elite graves, yet this division shows a growing web of interdependence, the foundation of a complex society. Long-term stability forces communities to think differently about management. There is no evidence of a ruling class, yet towns function smoothly. This suggests they rely on long-standing customs and natural consensus. Such quiet order later defines the Indus civilization itself. High organization without overt displays of power. Another sign of social coordination is the presence of communal water installations, reinforced with packed earth or rubble. In South Asia, water is always the axis of survival. When a shared water source becomes a maintained gathering point, it also becomes the axis of social life, a place for daily tasks, exchange, and sometimes seasonal rituals. A shared rhythm becomes unmistakable. Sowing season, harvest season, days for repairing roofs, times for firing kilns, moments for exchange. This repetition builds not only material order, but also a spiritual one, a sense that a community breathes together. Population grows steadily. Settlements stretch outward along rivers. Pottery kilns sit near metalworking areas. Dirt paths interlock into networks. Low embankments and simple fences rise, not to keep enemies out, but to safeguard an order built over generations. From these persistent changes, a decisive moment quietly forms. When towns become large enough, stable enough, and tightly connected, they step across an unseen threshold into a new kind of organization. Urban life. And that step becomes the opening of something extraordinary. The rise of the Indus civilization, a network of intricate, resilient, and remarkably quiet cities that would leave the ancient world in awe. From the need to preserve the stability that had strengthened across generations, the story shifts into a phase where center and outskirts begin to separate more clearly. The early towns, once simply seasonal gathering places, now carry the shape of communities learning to protect themselves, learning to honor the shared rhythm they had built through countless cycles of rain and sunlight. At first, protection did not arise from conflict between people, but from nature itself. The monsoon sent water rising without warning. Large animals wandered close to dwellings. Soft soil collapsed. Water sources became vulnerable to contamination. Livestock scattered. To cope, people planted bamboo fences, drove thorny branches into the ground, dug drainage trenches, and raised house foundations. These small gestures were the earliest form of defense, not confrontation, but the maintenance of stability. As towns grew more crowded, their pull reached farther. People from other areas arrived seeking exchange, steady water, or simply a familiar rhythm to lean on. But density brought friction, small disputes, competition for resources, tension between groups. To avoid disorder, the community had to draw boundaries, partly with natural materials, partly with quiet social habits maintained through mutual agreement. At many pre-Indus sites, archaeologists find low walls along pathways or around production areas. They were not built to repel invaders, but to separate functions. Pottery spaces, livestock areas, communal zones. These simple divisions reveal an early organizational mindset, the understanding that a growing community needs clarity to keep life from overlapping chaotically. At Kotdiji, a protective wall was built around the highest ground. This marked a significant shift in how people viewed the center. It was not necessarily a place of authority, but a place that held what mattered most: seeds, tools, stored goods, ritual objects. Protecting such a space shows that people had begun assigning value to areas based on importance, one of the fundamental ideas behind urban life. The most meaningful feature of this period, however, is not the walls or the trenches, but the birth of the idea of a core zone. Some places needed more care than others: the communal water source, seasonal ritual grounds, the marketplace, the grain store. Each became a point of gravity, a place where the community placed its memory, effort, and trust. From these shared points, social behavior slowly changed. Familiar paths were worn smooth not by deliberate planning, but by thousands of repeated steps. The route carrying goods to the exchange area, the walk to the water pit, the return home at dusk. Urban layout emerged from the rhythm of daily life, a kind of natural geometry shaped by collective habit. In several sites, wide patches of soil with ash and post holes reveal the presence of communal ritual spaces, ceremonies marking seasons, sowing rites, gatherings for storytelling. Though simple, these rituals created something no wall could provide: a sense of belonging. Once that feeling took root, it became a spiritual boundary, stronger than any physical structure. Out of this sense of unity, traditions tied to fire, water, and earth grew more defined: a seasonal act, an object used in ceremony, a shared gesture. Together, they shaped a feeling that the community did not simply live near one another. They lived with one another. At the same time, faint signs of social differentiation appear. Though no evidence suggests strict hierarchy, certain raised or well-protected areas hint that some individuals handled coordination, watching over water, managing food stores, supervising shared tasks. They were not rulers, but caretakers, people entrusted with responsibility. For that reason, the first boundaries were more than bamboo fences or packed earth walls. They were boundaries of thought, markers of a transition from loosely scattered groups to a community learning to safeguard shared value. Once this awareness solidified, the outcome became inevitable. A protected center became the nucleus of an emerging town, and the outskirts became the living ring that sustained it. And at precisely this threshold, the Indus civilization prepared to rise in full, quiet yet profound, steady yet brilliant, in a way that would astonish the ancient world. From the first boundaries raised to protect a fragile sense of stability, the story moves into a moment when many communities began experimenting with a new way of living, no longer just inhabiting space, but arranging it with shared purpose. This was the stage where people started shaping order for themselves rather than submitting entirely to the natural world. No one at the time had a name for this shift, yet every flattened courtyard and every brick pressed into place quietly opened the way to a new, embryonic form of urban life. Early centers like Kotdiji, Amri, and the first phase of Kalibangan reveal a long, deliberate attachment to the same ground. When a house collapsed, people did not walk away. They built over it. Over generations, tells formed, layered mounds where each strata held a fragment of lived time, turning the landscape into a book written page by page. Alongside this, space began to divide by function. Work areas shifted to the edges to avoid smoke and debris. Grain stores were placed on higher ground to stay dry. Open spaces between houses were preserved for councils, seasonal rites, or shared activities. These were the earliest brushstrokes of social architecture, people shaping their surroundings instead of letting their surroundings shape them. Dwellings changed with this mindset. Many regions stepped away from circular structures, once ideal for a moving life, and adopted square or rectangular houses with thick earthen walls and level floors. Such shapes allowed interior rooms, planned layouts, and expansion. They show a crucial shift. People began seeing space as something that could be designed, not just endured. As populations increased, pathways became essential. What started as natural foot trails gradually widened, straightened, and gained drainage channels along their edges. This marks a major transition. People were no longer merely enduring the monsoon. They were planning around it. Any settlement that integrated seasonal rhythms into its structure was moving closer to urban form. Specialized work spread quickly. Slag from copper alloys, blades, and arrowheads showed that early metallurgy had entered daily life. Potters, metalworkers, weavers, bead makers, their roles became more distinct. A person could no longer do everything alone, as in nomadic days, forcing communities into systems of mutual reliance. That interdependence became the backbone of a complex society. Many sites reveal circular or oval-leveled areas, gathering grounds for sheltering during storms, storytelling, training, or reaching seasonal agreements. Shared spaces gave settlements communal spirit. People were no longer simply neighbors. They were participants in a growing collective memory. Even as professions diversified, society remained relatively flat. There were no palaces, no massive tombs, no dominant authority structures. Order was maintained through experience, familiarity, and soft rules built across generations. This quiet discipline would later define the Indus civilization, deeply organized, yet almost silent about its power. As emerging centers expanded, inter-regional exchange became steady. Lapis lazuli from Badakhshan, carnelian from Gujarat, Makran shells, grinding stones from Rajasthan, all appeared far from their sources. These objects show more than trade. They reflect a new awareness. Each community belonged to a much wider network where goods and knowledge traveled together. When the shared rhythm strengthened enough, it produced something beyond habitation, the feel of a town. Social functions, pathways, production zones, meeting spaces, grain stores, kilns. They formed quiet trials, rehearsals for what a city could be. From these experiments, a civilization of carefully planned, resilient urban centers, rivaling Egypt and Mesopotamia, was preparing to rise. The people of these early towns had no idea they were laying foundations for Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, or Dholavira. They were simply repairing roofs before the rains, pressing bricks into place, leveling pathways, dividing grain, building new kilns. But it was precisely these quiet, repeated actions, not a sudden leap, that created the great shift, from village to town, from cluster to network, from scattered memory to urban life. And from here, the story moves toward the moment when the first true cities of the subcontinent take clear shape, when Indus becomes not just the name of a river, but the name of a civilization. From the early centers that had taken root over generations, the subcontinent entered a phase that spread quietly, like water rising during a gentle rain. Scattered settlements began to link, to exchange, then to blend into one another, forming a network with its own rhythm. No single event began this shift. It grew at the pace of the land itself, slow, steady, enduring. Agriculture had matured, crafts reached new refinement, and interregional contact became routine. Together, they formed the groundwork for a society capable of organizing itself in ways never seen before. Through this process, places like Kotdiji, Amri, and Kalibangan widened along the currents of exchange. People from the upper Indus carried wood, hides, minerals. Those from the lowlands brought salt, seashells, dried fish. From Gujarat came the warm red glow of carnelian, beads that would become the signature ornament of the Indus world. Each item carried not only material value, but the story of where it came from, its labor, its seasons, its technique. As objects moved across generations, subtle blends formed between communities once separated by vast distances. Homes in distant regions began to share the same visual rhythm: rectangular layouts with inner courtyards, thick earth walls, leveled floors, pathways lined with drainage, pottery decorated with wave motifs or repeating diagonal strokes. These similarities grew so widespread that they formed a kind of architectural language, not imposed by any central authority, but born from shared experience with soil, monsoon, wind, and silt. Faced with the same conditions, people discovered the same solutions, and their shared imprint spread without command or conquest. Naushara, Dholavira, and the regions near the lower Indus turned into nodes within this growing web. Trails crossing mountains, plains, and semi-arid lands acted like hidden arteries, carrying tools, craft skills, stories, and even the instinctive sense of changing seasons. From today's view, the network seems impossibly vast. To the people of that time, it was simply the path they had walked since childhood. As the network expanded, building techniques converged. Mud bricks appeared across many sites with near-identical proportions, easy to stack, easy to replace, easy to teach. No one knows whether anyone ever taught this standard to another region. More likely, the knowledge traveled with craftsmen who moved from place to place, settling quietly into the soil wherever they stopped. From this growing unity, the sense of a town transformed. A crowded place was no longer just many houses gathered together. It became a shared environment where benefits and responsibilities circulated. Large kilns served multiple families. Communal grain storage sat on higher ground. Deep wells became anchors for entire neighborhoods. These communities were not tied by bloodline, but by the need for steady rhythms, planting seasons, water cycles, and the timing of exchange. As populations rose, maintaining order became essential. No ancient text describes how they achieved it, yet archaeological details, aligned drainage, evenly spaced wells, grain stores in the driest zones, reveal a system guided by repetition and collective understanding. Stability depended not on coercive power, but on learned experience and the belief that a community endured only when everyone kept the rhythm together. Specialization intensified. Some places became bead-making hubs, Others focused on metalwork. Others produced high-quality pottery. Such diversification made exchange indispensable, and whenever exchange deepens, measurement follows. Small stone weights, marks carved on pottery, and early standardized units were the first steps toward the enigmatic Indus script. A great mystery today, but at that moment, simply the natural result of an increasingly organized society. Spiritual life also gained clearer form. On patches of earth marked by fire, scattered offerings, and thin layers of ash, we see evidence of shared meaning, a sensitivity to what lay beyond everyday tasks. They needed no great temples or towering idols. A fire on open ground, the night wind rising, the return of planting season. These were enough to plant the seeds of ideas that would later echo in the Vedic tradition. The first heartbeat of the Indus civilization emerged from these familiar acts. Hands lay in bricks, wells dug deep into the soil, channels carved to guide rainwater, footsteps wearing smooth the paths between wet and dry seasons. A heartbeat that grew wider with time, deeper with the earth, preparing for a moment soon to be revealed. The birth of some of the earliest true cities in human history. As the elements of countless millennia settled into place, stable seasons, refined techniques, expanding exchange, and the quiet accumulation of organizational memory, a profound shift unfolded. Pre-urban centers began to merge into true cities. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira. None of them appeared suddenly. They were the natural outcome of generations of alluvial soil, of shifting waterways, of habits that had already become instinct within the communities of the Indus. When we look at this moment, we witness the beginning of a new era, a time when cities did not simply rise. They redefined how human life could exist together. Mohenjo-Daro, around 2,600 to 2,500 before the Common Era, stands as the clearest expression of that maturity. Its street map is so precise that it startles the modern eye. Straight roads cutting into neat blocks, houses arranged in deliberate plots, each with its own well, its own bathing space, its own underground drainage, leading into a larger system beneath the city. Even more striking is what is absent: no palaces, no monumental statues, no structures designed to elevate a ruling figure above the population. The city is built at eye level, shaped not to display dominance, but to serve everyday life. The heart of society lies in smooth functioning, not in symbols of authority. That refinement grew from an extremely long memory of managing water. From early communal pits in the proto-towns to engineered drains with precise gradients, the people of the Indus treated water as the foundation of order. Every straight channel reflects an understanding of sanitation and labor organization. To keep a city breathing, they needed diggers, bricklayers, well keepers, people who monitored blockages, all bound by a shared idea. Collective benefit outweighed individual desire. A city like this cannot be created by a society that has settled only for a few generations. It requires memory of many environmental shifts, many floods, many seasons of correcting past mistakes. Harappa, hundreds of kilometers from Mohenjo-Daro, tells a parallel story. Massive brick kilns outside the settlement produced tens of thousands of bricks in a season. The 1 to 2 to 4 brick ratio, found almost everywhere across the Indus, allowed walls to stand firm, wells to remain symmetrical, and stairways to endure. No inscription explains the rule. Yet its widespread presence shows a society shaped by long-cultivated order, carried forward through lived experience rather than decrees. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of the Indus world is the quietness of its archaeological record. There are no signs of major wars, no thick layers of weapons, no mass graves of fighters, no cities burned by conquest. Defensive walls appear, but most serve to divide function or shield resources from unpredictable water levels. Cities relate through exchange, not domination. This has led many scholars to ask, did the Indus communities sustain a rare kind of consensus, a world where order grew from habit and cooperation rather than concentrated power? Small objects speak more clearly than any lost text. Carnelian beads polished so intensely they catch the sun. Stone weights small as a fingertip, yet astonishingly accurate. Pottery painted with waves. Seals carved with humped bulls, and symbols still undeciphered. Each artifact carries the pride of its maker and the sense of a society that relied on finesse, not intimidation. A lingering impression emerges. The cities of the Indus grew from the memory of water, from coastlines long lost beneath the sea, from rivers like the ancient Sarasvati shifting course, from generations learning the moods of monsoon and drought. The builders of Mohenjo-Daro likely never set out to create a civilization. They simply continued what they knew, laying bricks, leveling ground, managing water, sharing resources. The difference was scale, broader, steadier, more refined. When we look at the full network, Harappa in the north, Mohenjo-Daro along the Middle Indus, Dholavira in Gujarat, Lothal near the Arabian Sea, we do not see one dominant capital shaping the rest. Instead, we see a chain of cities, islands of memory connected by thousands of footsteps that once followed ancient routes of exchange. Each center beats with its own rhythm, but together they form one great pulse, the pulse of a civilization that listened to nature and found stability in a world forever shifting. Amid the quiet cities of the Indus, another current moves beneath the order of their streets and the precision of their drains, a current made of symbols and belief. There are no heroic epics, no surviving myths of kings, no carved record of world-shaking battles. What binds the people of Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, or Dholavira is a steady rhythm. Footsteps across cool brick floors, water sliding through stone-lined channels, the glow of kilns burning through the night, and the small, patient seals carved across many generations. From that physical world, the story turns toward a deeper stratum, the stratum of symbolic memory. Indus belief does not declare itself through monuments. It seeps into objects, gestures, and engraved images. Its roots draw from older communities, people who once followed a river that later vanished, who lived on coastlands now swallowed by the sea, who carried the memory of shifting water and wind within their seasonal routines. This was not a religion born from a single event. It grew quietly across countless lives. Among all surviving artifacts, the Indus seals offer the clearest doorway into that inner world. Animals dominate their imagery: the humped bull, the tiger, the rhinoceros, the antelope, the elephant, the crocodile. None appear as prey. All are still, composed, almost sacred. It is as if the inhabitants understood nature as a system with its own order, something to be respected, not conquered. Each creature seems to embody a quality, a rhythm, a fragment of a universe larger than human life. Among these shapes, one figure stands out: a seated person in a meditative posture, surrounded by animals. Often called Pashupati, the image is sometimes linked to the later deity Shiva. While certainty remains out of reach, it is difficult to deny the sense of continuity, that a spiritual lineage may stretch from deep prehistory into later Indian thought. Here, perhaps, lies an early seed of South Asian religious identity, a symbol created long before written myths, yet already heavy with inner meaning. Terracotta female figures tell a different story. Their rounded hips, full breasts, and life-nurturing posture reflect faith in earth, in season, in the endless renewal of life. Indus ritual was not grand, like those of Mesopotamia or Egypt. It was small, intimate, woven into the daily spaces of the settlement. A bit of fire, a handful of grain, a shaped piece of clay. This was a devotion carried by everyday gestures, sustained by trust in the earth itself. On pottery surfaces, patterns often repeat in groups of three dots, 3 lines, 3 faces. They might be decorative, or they might hint at cycles: water, earth, sky, or season, wind, rain, or perhaps 3 layers of time. Look long enough, and the cyclical mindset begins to echo the later philosophy of the Vedic hymns, a universe ruled by repeating rhythms, where harmony is the highest order. Such ideas may have lived quietly for ages before they were ever given names. What draws even more attention is what the Indus world does not depict. No warriors, no conquest scenes, no displays of power. Human figures appear calm, meditating, tending animals, or performing gestures we cannot decipher, perhaps ritual, perhaps reflective. This is a spiritual universe that seeks strength from within, not from force. Stability may have come from a worldview that understood nature as ever-changing. To survive, one needed a quiet center more than a high wall. The Indus script adds another layer of mystery. Short sequences of signs, just a few characters, appear on seals, pottery, jewelry, even bricks. Though undeciphered, their structure suggests clear function. Some mark origin, some classify, some relate to measurement. This was not a language for invoking gods, but a practical language of order, shaped by a society accustomed to long-term stability and careful organization. When you study seals carved with the fine hair of an antelope or the curve of a bull's neck, you feel that the knowledge behind them could not have emerged from a handful of generations. It must have traveled through thousands of years, from coastal communities of the Ice Age, from the inhabitants of ancient floodplains, from people who once marked their belongings with simple symbols as they followed the rivers. All those centuries accumulated into the symbolic system of the Indus, a legacy quiet in appearance, yet profound enough to outlast entire civilizations. This was a spiritual world grown through endurance, not sudden revelation, a gentle current fed by the oldest memory of the subcontinent, flowing steadily until it found its fullest form in the Indus cities. As the symbolic world of the Indus reveals itself through its small carved seals, a question drifts across the ancient soil like a layer of fine silt. Was the Indus the beginning, or simply the last crest of a long wave of communities who had lived through changes far greater than memory can contain? Their traces, simple rituals, brief inscriptions, sacred animal forms, sometimes feel like echoes of a history far older than archaeology can currently see. That question leads us into the landscape of oral memory, where stories of rising water are carried not by stone or wood, but by voices. The Indus people did not carve scenes of violent storms or raging seas. They did not build temples to warn of the sky's anger. Instead, their memories of flood survived in smaller ways. A curved line on a pot, a seasonal rite, a repeated rhythm in an evening tale. Across South Asian tradition, stories of a great rising water appear in many forms. One ancient version tells of Manu, a man warned about the coming flood, who survives on a small boat. The detail of his rope tied to a mountaintop carries the tone of myth, yet reflects a very real experience. The experience of communities who witnessed their landscapes transform more drastically than words could explain. When land vanishes, people search for images strong enough to keep the memory from fading. Some scholars believe the tale of Manu did not originate in the Vedic period, but came from much earlier groups along the Sarasvati, when the river was still full. If that origin is true, the memory of a great flood predates the Indus itself. Shaped by people who saw coastlines retreat inland, rivers change course, and plains turn into seafloor. Geology tells a parallel story in a different language. Around 12,900 to 11,500 years ago, sea levels rose sharply during two meltwater pulse events, pushing the South Asian shoreline inland by dozens of kilometers. The ancient Kaveri Delta drowned. The Gujarat shelf sank beneath dark blue water. The Bay of Bengal expanded, erasing valleys once inhabited by humans. These changes did not happen overnight, yet they were fast enough to leave an imprint on memory, and slow enough to become legend instead of pure catastrophe. Tamil tradition speaks of Kumari Kandam, a vast land swallowed by the sea. Whether or not it was a true civilization, the memory of a great drowned region lingers in language, poetry, and in the image of ancestors leaving a familiar shore to seek higher ground. Across the subcontinent, similar stories echo. Rivers shifting course and erasing villages, the sea moving into plains overnight, ancestors living where the ocean now lies. Their value is not in literal accuracy, but in their endurance. Each tale is a fragment of a shared experience, people living beside a nature that constantly reshapes itself, trying to hold on to what they cannot bear to lose. What makes South Asia's flood stories striking is their calm tone. No apocalypse, no divine curse, no ruin beyond repair. Water is viewed as a vast cycle, taken and returning, erasing and creating. Even the story of Manu ends not in despair, but in renewal. It suggests that ancient communities had lived through enough environmental change to stop seeing nature as an enemy. Water was part of life's rhythm, not a threat beyond control. From that familiarity came something essential: techniques for living beside water, habits shaped around seasonal cycles, ways of organizing life that kept communities safe through both flood and drought. When we look at the Indus, its straight drainage lines, deep wells scattered across the city, standardized bricks, and large central reservoirs, we feel that same spirit. Humans learning to move with nature instead of resisting it. Their art reflects this understanding as well. Waves painted on pottery, fish engraved on seals, the great bathing structure of Mohenjo-Daro, all place water at the center of existence. No chaos, no drama, just soft lines and gentle repetition, like reminders of endurance in a world that had already changed many times. This transformation, from fear to understanding, from loss to adaptation, is what allowed the Indus civilization to endure for so long. A community accustomed to cycles did not require war to protect itself. It needed order to move together through change. They built cities not to confront nature, but to remain grounded within its shifting rhythms. And from that memory, the Indus reached a rare equilibrium. No displays of dominating power, no endless conflict, only a society that rebuilt itself whenever the waters returned, the way a river always finds a new path to continue its flow. As we move deeper into the layers of memory lying beneath the ancient ground, a question rises like a pale light at the edge of the horizon. Were the stories of rising waters merely symbolic, or do they preserve the outline of a society that lived long before the Indus, a society whose traces now rest under the sea? Each generation has returned to the same uncertainty. If the Indus wasn't the beginning, then where is the opening chapter that the ocean carried out of sight? Looking back at sea levels at the end of the Ice Age, South Asia was once far larger than it is today. Thousands of kilometers of fertile land stretched from Gujarat to Tamil Nadu, from the coast of Maharashtra down to Kerala, places where rivers met the sea, where deltas shimmered with silt, where gentle beaches welcomed the monsoon winds. When sea levels surged more than 12,000 years ago, these landscapes vanished first. And from that disappearance emerges a quiet, persistent idea. Perhaps what archaeology uncovers now is only the later layer of a story that began long before the ocean reclaimed its ground. Within this context, the Gulf of Cambay stands as a compelling mystery. At depths of 30 to 40 meters lie straight lines, flat stone surfaces, and arranged blocks that resemble foundations. They are not clear enough to confirm human hands, yet too precise to dismiss as entirely natural. A few ceramic fragments dated to around 9,000 years old deepen the debate. Whatever the final conclusion, Cambay reminds us that the early history of South Asia is older and wider than what we currently hold. Farther south, near Kanyakumari, submerged stone terraces extend that question. Archaeology remains cautious, but oral tradition is not. From Kerala to Sri Lanka, from Tamil Nadu to the Maldives, stories circulate about a vast land between two oceans that sank beneath the waves. These tales may not describe a shining kingdom, yet they reflect the very real experience of communities forced inland as the sea pushed forward. When scientific language did not yet exist, memory found refuge in folklore, in song, in myths passed from parent to child. Another clue flows along the course of the ancient Sarasvati. If that river once cut across Rajasthan with strength, it must have supported stable communities long before urban forms appeared. Those riverbank groups likely used simple pottery, crafted beads, shaped stone tools, and gathered around fire during seasonal meetings. Not enough to form cities, but enough to form a way of thinking, a sense of order, a communal life with little stratification, a reliance on natural cycles. When we look at the Indus later, that mindset appears like groundwater beneath dry earth, unseen yet shaping everything above. This cultural landscape was almost certainly wider than what archaeology can map today. From Punjab down to Haryana, from Rajasthan to Gujarat, from the ancient western seaboard to the untouched plains of the east, the region feels like one continuous cultural belt, linked not by rulers, but by rivers, seasons, and shared rhythms. These early communities did not build towers or fortifications, yet they organized life around a quiet, enduring structure that held firm across generations. Because of this subtlety, the pre-flood world is often labeled a prelude rather than a civilization. But civilization does not always require palaces or monuments. Sometimes it is the product of time, of a society that manages to live peacefully long enough to leave its mark on many generations. By that measure, the pre-flood stratum is the deep bass note of South Asia's historical symphony, the low resonance running beneath every later chapter. When we observe the Indus worldview, its calm order, its steady organization, its lack of conflict, the continuation becomes unmistakable. Vedic fire rituals may echo ancient gatherings along the Sarasvati. The figure later called Pashupati may reflect the spirit of forest-dwelling communities who lived alongside large animals before writing ever appeared. Belief in cycles, rising waters, shifting coasts, land lost and land renewed, likely grew from communities who witnessed the coastline transform again and again. What stands out most is this: while the physical remains of the pre-flood world now rest under layers of water, its patterns of thought do not. No flood was large enough to wash away the habits of organization, the intuitive reading of nature, or the sense that the world moves in cycles rather than lines. That mindset endured, becoming an invisible foundation that nourished the Indus and flowed onward into the Vedic age. What makes this ancient layer so profound is not the hope of a definitive proof, but the way it expands our understanding of memory itself. Some memories survive not through stone or pottery, but through attitude, a calm acceptance of nature's changes, a belief that water is a beginning rather than a threat, and a trust that order can grow out of harmony instead of domination. In that shadowed space, between lost land and enduring memory, we begin to understand why the Indus became one of the most stable civilizations humanity has ever known. When we look closely at the mental framework shaped over thousands of years, we begin to see the spiritual inheritance left behind by the pre-flood communities. They did not build great cities or towering temples, and they left no elaborate myths of gods and kings. Yet they passed down something far more durable than stone, a way of sensing the universe. That worldview settled into collective memory, flowed into the Vedas, into folklore, into ritual, and slowly seeped into every layer of ancient Indian thought. At the core of this worldview lies an intuition sharpened by generations of watching the land change. The universe moves in cycles. Birth, existence, dissolution, and rebirth were not mystical ideas, but reflections of a lived reality. These communities watched rivers shift their routes with the seasons, coastlines advance and retreat, and fertile soil vanish only to return. They did not imagine the world as a line with a beginning and an end. They felt it breathing, swelling, falling, and rising again in renewed rhythm. In regions like Mesopotamia or Egypt, the landscape stayed relatively stable, shaping myths of fixed cosmic order. South Asia was different. Nature shifted constantly. Pre-flood communities lived long enough within that motion to understand that stability emerges only when humans adapt to the world, not when they attempt to dominate it. From that understanding came a unique intuition. The universe is not built from straight lines, but from circles. That intuition shaped how they saw the natural world. Water was not only nourishment, but memory. Fire was a bridge between the visible and the unseen. Earth was the field of renewal. Wind and forest formed spaces for contemplation. These symbols did not arise in large urban centers. They were born in an age when people lived close to nature every moment of the day. And so in early Indian thought, the sacred did not sit in the heavens. It lived on the surface of quiet water, in the crackle of fire, in the cool breath of morning soil. What is striking is that this worldview did not hinder the rise of Indus urbanism. It supported it. A community shaped by natural cycles naturally created internal order. Evenly laid drainage channels, standardized bricks, clean walkways, granaries, and sensible locations. There was no need for kings, for deep moats, or for monumental gods. Order lived in habit, built through countless seasons of rain and sunlight. This is why images of warfare are almost absent from Indus art. No warriors, no battle scenes, no reliefs of men with spears. This absence does not prove they lived without conflict, but it shows that military might was not the axis around which society turned. A people who had seen the land change again and again would know that long-term stability grows from harmony, not force. The Vedic fire rituals echo that ancient mindset. Fire was not an outburst of power, but a way of holding rhythm between human life and cosmic order. Rituals repeated by season and by hour reveal something older than the Vedas. The idea that ceremony helps maintain balance between the visible world and the one just beyond sight. Even the notion of sacred sound, mantra, may be a thread stretching back to the pre-flood era. The Indus script, though undeciphered, already suggests structural thinking. Short sequences, deliberate repetition, the appearance of symbolic tagging to maintain social order. A single sign did not tell a story, but it carried meaning recognized by all. In the same way, a mantra does not rely on grammar. Its value lies in vibration, a rhythm that mirrors the structure of the universe. Alongside this grew the intuition of non-duality, that all phenomena are interconnected. Indus cities expressed this through the seamless blend of living spaces, craft areas, water systems, and communal zones. Later, the Vedic world expressed it through philosophy, the entire universe as Brahman. Different expressions, same insight. The world does not operate through opposition, but through resonance. Perhaps the most distinctive part of the pre-flood worldview was the place of the human being within it. Humanity did not stand at the center. People were simply one strand in the wider fabric of nature. That humility made adaptation natural. No force, no ruler, no ritual could command the universe to obey human will. Thus, if temples existed, they were not built to overwhelm the eye. They were places for gathering, syncing with the seasons, and sensing the direction of the world. A worldview like this could only emerge from an extremely long encounter with geological change, from advancing seas, shifting rivers, and restless climates. Change repeated often enough does not produce panic. It produces understanding. This understanding became the spiritual layer that flowed from the pre-flood world into the Indus, then into the Vedic age, forming one of the deepest philosophical traditions humanity has ever known. That worldview, gentle, cyclical, encompassing, is the most enduring legacy the pre-flood era left behind. And from the deeper layers of thought shaped by generations before the Great Flood, another memory begins to rise. The memory of the sky. All the pieces we have explored so far, the cycles of land, the steady observation of water, fire, and wind, the inner order of ancient communities, the short but logically patterned Indus symbols, start to align and point upward. The earth holds our footsteps, but the sky holds our sense of time. And perhaps, long before the first cities emerged, the people of South Asia had already learned to read the heavens as a way of remembering their own lives. Any society hoping to survive countless seasons of flood and drought needed to know when rains would come, when fish would run, when winds would shift, and how long the balance between day and night would last. That kind of knowledge cannot be born within a single lifetime. It comes from many communities watching the same sky for thousands of years. The Vedas speak of the moon, the sun, the monsoon, and the stars, as if they were familiar neighbors, not distant mysteries. This suggests an astronomical tradition far older than the Rig Veda, one rooted in the memory of people who once lived on lands now lying beneath the sea. If we imagine the time when the continental shelf still stretched wide, the coastline of South Asia extended far beyond today's shores. Before them lay a calm, mirror-like ocean. Above them stretched a sky untouched by mountains or artificial light. Every star that moved was reflected on the water. When a star touched the horizon, it was more than a sight to admire. It was a signal to travel or wait, to fish or avoid storms, to begin a journey or delay it for another cycle. People who lived by the sea for thousands of years must have learned to read the heavens the way we read a text. The Rig Veda contains precise descriptions of the moon's phases, the sun's apparent path, and the seasonal positions of constellations. Such knowledge could not have formed in a few generations living inland. It reads like a summary, a distillation of what pre-flood communities once observed with the naked eye. The early Vedic people may not have known the age of what they inherited, but the structure of their knowledge shows it was the product of a very long tradition. One of the clearest traces of that tradition appears in the image of the Sapta Rishi, the 7 sages linked to the 7 bright stars of the Great Bear. For pre-flood communities, the Great Bear was a natural compass, changing with the seasons, circling through the year, and at times pointing toward the north. As they watched those 7 points of light over many lifetimes, each movement became a story, each position a reminder. The figure of the 7 sages may well be a mythologized memory of a sky-reading practice that lasted for countless years. The cities of the Indus did not forget this heritage. Dholavira, Mohenjo-Daro, and Kalibangan are all aligned almost perfectly along the cardinal directions. One person can build a house as they please, but for an entire city to face the same orientation requires continuous knowledge of the sun. Several gates in Dholavira are positioned so that the light of specific days in the year passes through them, not by accident, but as a kind of calendar carved into architecture. Time itself was embedded in the layout of their cities. Even wells, courtyards, and doorways were placed to catch the right seasonal light. Seen from above, Indus cities resemble vast clocks, powered not by gears, but by sunlight and water. Timepieces that needed no hands, only the sky. The deepest layer of this pre-flood astronomical legacies appears in the system of nakshatra, the 27 or 28 lunar mansions. The Rig Veda speaks of them as sky markers for measuring time. Nakshatras could not have arisen in a short span of years. They required people to watch the moon cross the same points thousands of times, to remember subtle shifts, seasonal patterns, and tidal rhythms. This makes the nakshatra system one of the oldest astronomical frameworks in human history, very likely born when the seas had not yet swallowed the ancient coasts of India. If we picture those coastal groups living when the land stretched twice as wide, It is easy to imagine them placing simple stone markers along the horizon to track the moon's passage. When the waters eventually rose and covered those shores, the markers disappeared, but the knowledge survived. It was carried forward in stories, woven into oral traditions, and finally absorbed into the Vedic vision of the cosmos. When we gather the myths of the 7 sages, the urban geometry of Indus cities, the placement of Dholavira's gates, the experience of monsoon winds, the water calendar, and the nakshatra system, a picture appears, not of a late invention, but of a tradition stretching back to the pre-flood world. A tradition shaped by the greatest geological changes of the post-glacial age. Ancient Indian astronomy was therefore not separate from daily life. It was a way for people to remain steady in a world that constantly changed shape, measuring time by light, marking seasons by stars, keeping communal rhythm through water and shadow. It was the knowledge of those who once stood on shorelines, long vanished, watching the sky reflected on the surface of the ocean like the mirror of the universe. And although most of that land now lies quiet beneath the sea, the spiritual legacy, the ability to read nature in order to understand ourselves, still lives on in every hymn, every season, and every open sky of the subcontinent. As the ancient communities learned to read the movements of the sky, they were also shaping a bridge between heaven and humankind, a bridge not built of stone or timber, but of a deep intuition carried through generations. The foundations of early Indian thought did not burst forth in a sudden blaze. They rose quietly from an old awareness that the world moves through layered rhythms, intersecting between what is visible and what lies far beneath the reach of ordinary words. The people who laid the groundwork for the Rig Veda likely retained many habits from the pre-flood world and from Indus towns. Sitting around a fire, repeating the earliest syllables of mantra to keep their lives aligned with the rhythm of nature. They were not inventing a religion. They were preserving a thread that had existed since a distant age, a thread that once guided their ancestors through rising seas, cracked earth, and shifting riverbeds. In that context, fire did not represent triumph. It was a point of spiritual balance, a breath of light helping the community cross the darkness of night toward the first glow of dawn. The Rig Veda holds images that appear simple, but are astonishingly deep. Agni carrying prayers upward, Surya as the unblinking eye of the sky, Varuna guarding the balance of the universe. These figures could not have emerged in a community that had just taken root. They reflect experiences layered across generations who lived beside wet soil, early monsoon rains, wandering rivers, and the sorrow of losing familiar lands to the sea. A worldview like this requires long maturity. It is the distilled essence of many ages, not the invention of a single generation. Astronomical references within the Rig Veda show that its hymns mirror a sky from the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, or even earlier. When knowledge this precise survives in an oral text, it becomes clear that its core is the crystallization of a tradition far older than the Rig Veda itself. That tradition may have begun among the pre-flood coastal groups, continued within Indus towns, aligned to the path of the sun, and eventually merged into the spiritual world of the Vedic people. One of the most distinctive elements of Vedic thought lies in its view of ritual. Ritual was not meant to beg for favor, but to maintain RTA, the harmonious rhythm of the cosmos. Arta was neither law nor the will of a supreme deity. It was more like breath, the sunrise, the shift of the monsoon, the receding of water that softens the land, the first sprout breaking the soil. When RTA remained steady, society held its order. Such a worldview could only arise in communities that had lived through constant natural change and understood that stability comes from cooperation with the cycle, not resistance to it. This is why fire became the center of Vedic culture. During yajna, people placed into the flame the most ordinary gifts: rice, milk, flowers, incense. Each offering was a quiet acknowledgement that humans belong to a movement larger than themselves. Fire transformed matter into light. Light opened a path toward the unseen, and the cycle returned again to Earth. This idea likely began in an age long past, when fire was the single source of safety for coastal groups facing long nights, strong winds, wild animals, and the vast darkness beyond their shelters. Water also holds a central place in the Rig Veda. Rivers, rain, lakes, and the sea are not described as chaotic forces, but as beings with memory. Sarasvati appears far grander than the diminished river known today, perhaps an echo of the mighty ancient Sarasvati before it dried. In this sense, the Rig Veda becomes the final mirror reflecting a world of water that had already begun to recede. When viewed in depth, the Vedic worldview does not resemble that of newly arrived settlers. A philosophy centered on cycles, transformation, and balanced rhythm could only grow from a society accustomed to shifting landscapes, yet able to remain whole. The Indus and the pre-flood cultures lived with those shifts. The Vedic community simply gave them names, shaping long-held truths into spoken hymns. What is remarkable is that Vedic thought never disconnects people from life. It does not demand withdrawal from the world or promise paradise beyond death. It simply says, live in rhythm, and the world remains at peace. A philosophy as modest as it is enduring, both a spiritual diary and a blueprint for order in a society that had already known deep loss. Even the way they pass down knowledge reflects the memory of the pre-flood world. Wisdom had to travel by ear, through the teacher's voice and the student's memory, just as coastal ancestors once transmitted their understanding of tides, light, and wind. Knowledge survived not through writing, but through repetition. Each recitation was an act of keeping the universe aligned. As the Vedic community widened its horizons, it began asking larger questions. If the cosmos moves through endless cycles, where do humans belong within it? Not to claim dominion, but to understand how to join the greater whole. These quiet questions became the first seeds of Indian philosophy, not explosive or dramatic, but spreading softly through the mind, like slow light gliding across water, carrying thought from an ancient shoreline toward a vast new spiritual space. From the night fires and the slow-turning sky, a quiet shift unfolded. People across the subcontinent began turning their gaze inward, toward the nature of their own existence. These were not the questions of scholars, but of those who lived between earth, water, and sky, who felt the fragility of life before a universe too vast to grasp. Who am I? Where did I come from? What keeps me standing? These questions rose in moments when the water no longer reflected their faces, when the wind changed without warning, when the stars drifted across the sky in a pattern no hand could touch or alter. What makes early Indian philosophy unique lies in the soil of its birth. No temples, no carved stone slabs, no kings demanding explanations. It grew through stories carried across generations, in the heat of a fire, in the morning walk to the well, in the awareness that the world changed too often to treat anything as a permanent anchor. Their philosophy was not forged from logical argument. It was shaped by witnessing nature's cycles repeat until intuition slowly ripened into insight. The Rig Veda, often seen as a collection of hymns, contains questions that stop modern readers in their tracks. What is the origin of heaven and earth? What sustains order? What existed before the universe formed? These hymns do not force the world into a single answer. Many end with an openness as gentle as the day's last breeze. The gods may know, or perhaps even they cannot grasp, the full truth. This tone comes from a society accustomed to change, a people who understood that truth cannot be possessed, only approached, then released again like the tide. Amid this landscape, the seed of Atman, the deepest layer of the human being, began to grow. People who had watched land collapse, rivers abandon their beds, and the sea creep closer understood that no landscape remains forever. They looked for stability elsewhere, in breath, in the quiet, behind thought, in the simple awareness of being that did not shift with the world. From that place, Atman emerged as the one durable presence in a universe of relentless motion. In contrast, the idea of Brahman, the all-pervading reality, arose from seeing order inside the very flow of change. The sun rose and set, monsoons turned like a wheel, rain returned at its season, rivers filled, then sank. This order could not be grasped by the hand, yet it could be felt through long intimacy with the natural world. Over countless seasons, people sensed that behind each phenomenon was a shared pulse, a quiet foundation moving everything from within. These early seeds would later bloom in the Upanishads, but their roots lie far deeper, among pre-flood communities who watched shadows shift across the ground, marked water levels rising and falling, and traced the moon's circle across a mirror-still ancient sea. A person living long within the weave of river, sea, and wind would eventually see the world as a vast, invisible net, a movement at one edge, trembling the thread at another. That understanding seeped into Indus thought, a trading network stretching hundreds of kilometers, and continued into the Vedic mind. From here, it is no wonder that early Indian thinkers saw knowledge as the ability to recognize the hidden ties between things that seemed distant. When they observed the sky, they saw their own essence reflected in the shifting light. When they watched the river, they saw the flow of life itself. When they looked at fire, they saw a bridge between the finite and the infinite. The world was not split into separate parts, but connected by rhythms too subtle for the eye alone. Another delicate detail lies in how they spoke about words. In a society without written script, speech was the home of memory. Children learned by listening. Elders preserved knowledge through the cadence of their voices. Knowledge survived because it was spoken each day. For this reason, mantra in the Vedic world was more than sacred syllables. It was a form of order. When uttered in the right rhythm, the world held its balance. When misaligned, life fell into disorder. This was the spiritual inheritance of coastal pre-flood communities who once listened to waves and wind to measure time and direction. The deepest quiet of early Indian philosophy lies in how it never separated thought from daily life. People pondered not to construct grand systems, but to discover how to remain steady in a world capable of transforming within a few seasons of rain and drought. In lands where wide plains could turn barren, where rivers might carve new paths in a generation, the greatest question was not, how does the universe work? But where should a human being stand so as not to be swept away? That question carried both humility and awakening, a lesson distilled from thousands of years of living beside change that could not be avoided. And as these ideas passed gently from one generation to the next, they became the ground from which all of Indian philosophy grew. Unhurried, unadorned, and quiet as an ancient forest, adding rings to its trunk, opening a spiritual journey that would stretch across millennia. From a reservoir of memory accumulated across countless generations, a new moment slowly emerged. The moment when reflections once carried only by the human voice began taking shape in chants, in ritual rhythms, and eventually in written form. The birth of the Vedas was not a sudden turning point, but the next step in a long stream of spirit that had flowed long before writing existed. Knowledge in ancient India was never treated as something stored on a page. It was a living presence, something that needed to be breathed, sung, memorized, and passed on to keep the world's rhythm from breaking. When early communities gathered their mantras, melodies, and invocations into the collections, later called the Rigveda, Samaveda, Yajurveda, and Atharva Veda, they were not building a fixed religion or a rigid system. What they sought to preserve was the pulse of the universe itself, the breath of fire, the path of the wind, the moment water changed color at the start of monsoon. These hymns carried the echo of life along rivers, forests, and floodplains, places where people had watched soil collapse, water rise, and the sky shift its bearings, and had to discover some order that allowed them to remain upright through it all. What makes the Vedic texts unique is how they formed like the layered memories of pre-flood communities. There was no single author. Each verse carried a different era. Some lines echo the voices of those who once lived near the ancient shoreline. Some stem from early settled villages. Others reflect societies already familiar with sacrificial fire and seasonal agriculture. The Rigveda, in this sense, is like a river formed from many tributaries, each branch flowing from a different age, all merging into one continuous current. From this foundation, Indian thought branched into several paths. One path leaned toward ritual, seeing the maintenance of RTA, the cosmic order, as the anchor of communal life. Another path turned inward, asking about ultimate reality and the quiet place where Atman resides. A third path blossomed into poetry, capturing the glow of dawn, the voice of rivers at night, the silhouettes of stars in verses filled with awe. These threads wove together like the river networks that had once nourished the ancient land. The rise of the Brahmanas and Aranyakas marked another shift. People began interpreting their own rituals, not to change them, but to understand the meaning behind each motion, each spark of fire, each line of chant. This reveals a rare capacity for self-observation, a desire to understand why a sacred act held the power to sustain order. This quiet, intellectual move recalls the mindset of communities who once lived close to shifting landscapes. To survive, they had to search for the reasons behind every change in the natural world. Then came the Upanishads, guiding the spiritual stream into even deeper waters. These texts turned inward, no longer describing rituals, but confronting the nature of existence itself. Many passages sound like the whisper of someone who has endured loss after loss. What we search for outside has always lived within. When placed beside memories of rivers leaving their beds, seas swallowing the shore, and earth turning to water, the inward turn becomes clear. Philosophy sought an anchor the land could no longer guarantee. From this shift, Atman gained its central place, the most subtle part of a human being, untouched by the world's upheavals. Brahman emerged as the all-encompassing reality, the foundation beneath every form and movement. Between these two poles, ancient Indians recognized something profound, that liberation did not lie in power, but in perceiving that one belongs to a rhythm greater than oneself. Such an insight could only grow in a society shaped by a natural world that was gentle yet firm, ever-changing yet not cruel. One subtle feature of this tradition lies in how it viewed knowledge. Understanding did not belong to material objects. It traveled through the voice. A hymn survived through memory, through the teacher's cadence, through the breath of repetition. This form of transmission mirrors life along pre-flood coasts and rivers, where people depended on the sound of waves and wind to measure time and direction. Knowledge lived because it was spoken, not because it was carved into stone. When these thoughts were finally written down, they did not lose their living quality. Like the cities of the Indus, structured yet open, planned yet touched by wind, the Vedas remained alive. They are among humanity's earliest attempts to articulate the order of the cosmos, not to command it, but to understand one's place within its turning. A turning that never stops, yet carries a deep pulse, linking generations, linking communities who endured nature's shifting face again and again across the ages. Stepping into the landscape of early philosophies, we see that thought in the subcontinent did not appear as a closed system, but as a way of reading the universe, the outcome of a long search for harmony. From pre-flood communities to the Indus region and into the Vedic world, generations living within the cycles of earth and sky distilled their experiences into layers of reflection. What emerged was not a set of doctrines, but open pathways, gentle corridors inviting people to reconsider their place within the vast web of existence. When the Upanishads introduced the first seeds of Atman and Brahman, the Rishi, sages wandering through forests, began walking different routes of inquiry. Their paths varied, yet they shared one intuition. Life is the rhythm of the cosmos, inseparable and never isolated. Philosophy, therefore, never insisted on final answers. It created space for each person to align their inner being with the deeper order of the world. The clearest imprint of this era is the rise of the 6 classical schools: Nyaya, Vaisheshika, Samkhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. Their value lies not in their names, but in how each one preserved a fragment of ancient memory, echoes of the knowledge that once helped people survive in a landscape always shifting. Nyaya placed reason and evidence at its center. This mirrors how early communities once read animal tracks, distinguished shallow from deep water, and sensed changes in wind direction. Understanding cause and effect could decide survival. And so Nyaya treated clarity of perception as the foundation for understanding the world. Vaisheshika broke reality into the smallest units, carrying forward the old habit of watching nature with meticulous attention. Dust carried by wind, water slipping through stone, sparks of ash falling like grains. From such observations emerged the intuition that the world moves through subtle building blocks governed by unwavering order. Samkhya paired Purusha, spirit, with Prakriti, nature. These two poles reflect the experience of communities who lived through soil collapsing, rivers shifting, and coasts disappearing. The outer world was in constant motion, yet something within remained still. From this contrast arose the sense that humans possess a part untouched by upheaval. Yoga, extending Samkhya, was born from the need to steady the mind amid uncertainty. Those who had faced storm nights, sudden floods, or sinking earth understood the power of focused awareness. Early yoga was not a series of postures. It was the skill of keeping the mind from being swept away by change. Mimamsa treated ritual as a way of maintaining the rhythm of the world. In a society shaped by monsoon cycles, droughts, and floods, stability came from placing actions in the right moment. Mimamsa searched for meaning in every gesture and chant, not to gain favor, but because a misaligned act could unsettle the entire community. Vedanta, the summit of these developments, asked a simple but profound question. If everything belongs to a single whole, what prevents us from seeing it? The answer did not point outward, but toward the limits of perception itself. Vedanta neither dismissed nor demanded. It left space for each person to find their own bridge between the inner self and ultimate reality. Looking at this diversity, one might assume Indian philosophy grew in isolation. Yet every path remained anchored to earth and sky, the tilt of light, the turn of monsoon winds, the movement of stars, the breath of rivers. Philosophy did not grow in ivory towers. It grew in fields and on riverbanks, places where living and understanding were inseparable. Each school is like a branch of a river, diverging from the same ancient source. That source began on coasts now submerged, flowed through the Indus cities, and merged with the breath of the Rig Veda. This is why none of the schools sought to erase the others. They illuminated one another, like different angles cast upon the same sky. A deeper thread runs through these philosophies. Truth was not viewed as a fixed stone, but as layers of perception. To approach its core, one had to peel back each covering, much like uncovering an ancient shard of pottery with the patience of generations. Knowledge arrived not through victory and debate, but through the quiet clearing of the mind, the way morning mist lifts from a field. Philosophy in this era did not aim for a final verdict. It felt more like an invitation to see the cosmos through the inner eye and to see the inner life through the light of the cosmos. A long echo from pre-flood memory, from communities who once believed life was not a race, but a search for the rhythm shared by everything that breathes. As thought spread into many directions, the story returns to the ground that sustained everything, the natural world. Philosophy may guide understanding, but people still lived by the water of a river, by the soil that changed color with the seasons, and by the paths shaped by countless footsteps. No civilization survives apart from its environment. The Indus, steady and quiet, was no exception. What makes the transformation of the Indus so striking is that it did not unfold through fiery catastrophe. No armies arrived, no fortresses fell, no traces of mass violence. The civilization simply began to lean, the way a young river shifts its bed, slow, steady, irreversible. The very forces that once sustained the Indus, water, seasons, silt, gradually reshaped it. When we compare ancient maps of the northwestern subcontinent, it becomes clear that this civilization was not built on a single river, but on an entire system. At the heart of that system flowed the Sarasvati, the river the Rig Veda calls the mother of rivers, once wide and deep enough to support hundreds of towns and a vast network of exchange. Then, nature changed its rhythm. Around the years 2000 to 1900 before the Common Era, geological shifts in the Himalayas redirected the meltwater streams. Much of the flow that once fed the Sarasvati turned toward the Ganges basin instead. It was not a sudden disaster, but it lasted long enough to unbalance an entire cultural world. Soil cracked, wells dried, harvests grew uncertain. A building can withstand a storm. No one can withstand a drought that slowly deepens across generations. Archaeology tells a story unlike the usual endings of ancient civilizations. No scenes of flight, no bodies from panic, no layers of fire across homes. Cities were abandoned slowly, as if people were simply leaving a house that no longer matched their rhythm of life. The Indus did not collapse, it dispersed. Those who once lived in Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, Kalibangan, and many other towns moved in different directions, especially eastward, toward the young Ganges, where fertile silt spread generously and the monsoon became the deciding force of life. In these new lands, they encountered a different rhythm. Instead of relying on the steady flow of a river, they learned to live with alternating wet and dry seasons, with rains that could not be predicted, but always returned. In this shifting landscape, many Indus traditions did not disappear. They changed shape. Monochrome pottery evolved into the gray ceramics of PGW cultures. Sun-dried brick houses gave way to wooden homes in forested regions. Urban standardization softened into seasonal measurement and practical surveying. The techniques did not die. They adapted, like water from an old riverbed flowing into a new course, still the same water. What makes the Indus transformation compelling is how its people chose to respond. They didn't resist nature. They moved with it. Since pre-flood times, coastal ancestors had learned to follow the rising sea. The Indus communities continued that intuition. Instead of fortifying and fighting, they spread outward, blending into younger landscapes, while carrying the memory of a social system that had produced one of the most harmonious civilizations in history. And so, the Indus did not vanish from the human map. It unfolded into many smaller streams, some groups drifting toward the coastal plains of Gujarat, some following rivers into the Himalayan foothills, some merging with communities in the northeast. Their spirit was never buried. It was planted in new soil. During this transition, old symbols turned into ideas. The great water tanks became images of purification in ritual. River cycles became breathing cycles in meditation. Seal markings became the cadence of chants. The material faded, the spiritual deepened. If Mesopotamia ended in war, and Egypt shifted through dynastic struggle, the Indus faded like evening light settling on water. No one can name the exact moment it dimmed, but everyone can sense the change in the air. A civilization did not fall. It simply tilted away from its old center. And when the Indus people stepped onto new ground, they carried tools, seeds, techniques, and a legacy deeper than any artifact. The universe moves in cycles. Society endures when it understands those cycles. And every change is only a small fold within a much larger rhythm. There is no single break that separates the Indus from the traditions that followed. everything shifted into a new rhythm with the quietness of a changing season. The water receding softly, sunlight tilting at a gentler angle, the sky losing a shade of blue. Archaeologists give this era dry, technical names: cemetery, ochre-colored pottery, painted gray ware. But behind those labels lived communities who simply kept going, carrying their ancestors' memory like groundwater flowing beneath the earth. Across many post-Indus sites, familiar habits appear like fingerprints of an age that never truly ended. Carnelian beads were still polished to a warm shine, proof that Harappan craftsmanship did not vanish. Pottery changed color, yet kept its even firing. Hearths sat where they always had. Floors remained carefully packed. Grains were stored the way they'd been stored for centuries. There was no rupture, only adaptation to lands where earth, wind, and water followed different rhythms. The farther east one goes, the more subtle the echoes of the Indus become. On the young, wide plains of the Middle Ganges, a landscape renewed each year by fresh silt. Painted gray ware emerges as a signal of a new age. Its soft gray replaces the old red-brown, and its thin lines feel like the first breaths of a story just beginning. The potter changed the color, but the way he felt the clay turned it, shaped it. That was the continuation of a long, patient tradition. The greatest shift lay in the rhythm of life itself. If the Indus world belonged to stability, deep wells, large water tanks, straight drainage lines, then the Ganges world belonged to the monsoon. A single rain could determine a year of plenty or a year of hunger. Planting time was guided less by engineered water systems and more by the breath of the sky. So the post-Indus communities learned flexibility, to retreat, to wait, to adjust, rather than cling to an older pattern no longer suited to the land. Where these two traditions met, the organizational memory of the Indus and the cyclical intuition of the Vedic groups, a new cultural stream began to form. Not a clash, but a blending. Carnelian beads lying beside ritual objects, post-Indus copper tools appearing in settlements shaped by Vedic custom. There's no sign of conquest, only a seamless merging, like two rivers meeting and becoming one. In this setting, social structures began to shift as well. In the Indus world, order grew from shared habits and silent consensus. But on the Ganges plain, with its dense forests, large animals, and rising population, forming alliances and local leaders became natural. Not to dominate, but to coordinate, to keep rhythm in a landscape wider and more complex than before. From here, the first seeds of political structure were planted. On one side was the Vedic tradition of assembly and discussion. On the other was the post-Indus skill of dividing space with balance and purpose. Together, they created a half-settled, half-mobile pattern of life that paved the way for large villages, the fundamental unit of ancient Indian society. Small details in the post-Indus cultures became foundations for future kingdoms. The standardized Harappan brick ratio influenced early architectural measurement. Indus weights and units became the basis of riverine trade. The division of settlement workshop ritual space reappeared in the large Ganges villages. These were not remnants. They were groundwater feeding the future. A question often arises: why didn't the people who built Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa immediately build cities on the Ganges plain? The answer lies in the land itself. The plain was too young, too wet, too thick with forests. Wildlife roamed close. The soil lacked long-term stability. Rivers shifted course suddenly. Large cities would not have endured. So people chose a softer path, building big villages, forming networks. A calm, adaptive strategy from communities who had already lived through multiple cycles of natural change. From those villages, the earliest buds of ancient Indian civilization, economic, technical, ritual, philosophical, slowly began to bloom. Not as a dramatic revival, but as tender shoots rising after a long monsoon. The Indus civilization did not disappear. It seeped downward, becoming the spiritual silt that nourished everything that came after. From the large villages that formed after the great movement away from Punjab and Sindh, the story leads us into a time when communities on the Ganges plain began to connect in a quiet, unforced way. No noise, no marks of empire, just the rhythm of the land and the freshness of a young river. The shift spread gradually, as softly as the sky changing at the end of a season. No one could point to a single moment when it began, yet everyone living then must have felt it unfolding. Those who left the Indus entered a very different world. The Ganges was still young, changing its course after a single monsoon. The land was damp, the forests dense, the riverbanks lacked the stability once found in Harappan terrain. Yet these new communities didn't falter. They had already survived great transformations, rising seas, retreating rivers, sinking earth. Those memories taught them that adaptability, not resistance, was the root of resilience. So instead of rebuilding brick cities, they opened their settlements with lighter materials, low wooden houses, thatched roofs, open earthen courtyards for fire rituals. These settlements were not simple villages. They were centers of exchange, where farmers, potters, bead makers, ritual specialists, and sky readers met. There were no city walls, but internal cohesion was strong. There was no geometric city plan, but the seasonal rhythm kept a gentle order. Over time, these large villages knitted themselves into wider regions, forming centers with their own pull. Some grew through metalwork, others through agriculture, others through ritual gatherings. Their forms varied, yet beneath them lay a shared Indus spirit, balanced spatial organization, soft social order, and a community-first ethos rather than dominance of any single leader. The most intriguing element of this era was the meeting of Indus craftsmanship and Vedic thought. One carried precision in measurement, pottery techniques, and knowledge of water. The other brought fire rituals, mantra, and ways of reading the sky. When these two currents blended, they gave rise to a society neither nomadic nor urban, something in between, like the landscape itself, searching for its most sustainable course. In many places, ritual grounds began to expand. Wide earthen courts, raised brick platforms, clay seating for participants. Their simplicity echoed the Indus spirit, architecture built for function, not spectacle. At the same time, the sense of time began to shift. The Indus world had read time through water, the depth of wells, the feel of silt, the rhythm of flow. The Ganges plain read time through monsoon patterns, rainfall, thunder, the breath of the soil as it dried or softened. Rituals grew more tightly linked with seasons and celestial cycles, making this region an especially fertile ground for Vedic thought to deepen. Trade routes spread through the forests along these rhythms. Carnelian beads, the signature craft of the Indus, appeared far along the Ganges corridor. That meant traders had carried old skills into new networks. There was no tension between technology and ideology. the two traditions supported each other. Precision met symbolism, prehistoric memory met cosmic philosophy, and so the plain grew in both material richness and spiritual depth. As some centers grew larger, a new social pattern emerged. Not quite village, not yet city. Places like Atranjikara, Hastinapur, and Kaushambi became meeting grounds for craftspeople, clan leaders, merchants, and ritual specialists. Early forms of leadership appeared, not absolute kings, but coordinators of alliances, people who kept balance among diverse groups. This transition felt gentle because their inherited mindset was gentle. They believed order lived in rhythm, not in walls. When rhythm held, a center expanded naturally and became proto-urban, not through political force, but through the organic needs of a growing community. Looking at the map of that era, we see what had been flowing quietly through countless generations. The Indus did not vanish. It transformed. From cities to villages, bricks to earth, water tanks to monsoon fields, carved seals to spoken chants. The old current continued in new form, steady as the monsoon winds that feed the vast plain, quiet, patient, and unbroken. From the growing centers of the Ganges plain, the story carries us into a time when power began to take on a new shape. It was not the shape of ambition, but of necessity. More people, heavier harvests, longer trade routes, and a soft village tribal order that could no longer hold the rhythm for everyone. Communities needed a shared anchor, the way a young river seeks a new channel when the land beneath it shifts. From that rhythm, the Janapada began to appear. They were not kingdoms in the later sense, but wide community regions where people shared seasons, rituals, and responsibilities. Within each Janapada, certain leaders earned trust because they could keep balance between person and person, season and season, interest and harmony. From this role emerged the Rajan, not a figure on a throne, but someone standing at the center of the fire circle. Power in these early days did not revolve around force, it revolved around trust. That trust had deep roots in the experience of prehistoric communities. To live long, one had to move in rhythm with nature. That old memory followed people from the coasts of the late Ice Age, through the Harappan world, and into the Ganges plain, where a new kind of social structure was quietly forming. Each Janapada grew in its own direction, shaped by climate and trade routes. Some centered on farming and the pulse of the seasons, some on ritual and spiritual cohesion, some on the momentum of exchange and craftsmanship, and some kept the simplicity of early communal life. Among them, several regions slowly became the cores of a new era. Kuru, where Vedic tradition was gathered and systematized. Panchala, where ritual, knowledge, and community formed a delicate unity. Kosala and Videha, where the first towns became political and social hubs. Magadha, where fertile soil, minerals, and trade routes offered lasting advantage. None of these centers rose with proclamations. They grew like rice after a long monsoon, steady, quiet, continuous, never breaking from older traditions, but clearing the way for new forms to emerge. What truly marked this period was not the birth of kings, but the shift in thinking, from memory to system. Indus memory, precise measurement, soft organization, community first order. Vedic rhythm, cosmic cycles, fire ritual, mantra as a spiritual rail. These two streams merged, and power sprouted from their meeting point. As that happened, early urban centers began to expand. Places like Kosambi, Rajgir, and clusters along the Yamuna took shape with main streets, exchange zones, earthen walls, and gathering grounds. Even so, the urban form did not seek grandeur. It served the community in the same Indus spirit. Order lived in function, not in monuments. At the same time, ideas flowed widely. Discussions of duty, justice, and the individual's role within a community grew familiar. Conversations no longer happened only by riversides or in forests, but within councils where people met as collective decision-makers. This environment quietly prepared the soil for the great traditions that would soon follow: Buddhism, Jainism, and deeper branches of Vedanta. The beauty of this era lies in the harmony between old and new. Early kingdoms did not see themselves as founders of a brand new age. They were the next step in a long river of time, a river that had flowed past ancient coasts, through Harappa, along the fading Sarasvati, and into the Ganges basin through waves of migration. There was no declaration of a new civilization, no rejection of the past, only transformation. Looking at the network of Janapada, linked by trade, bound by ritual, illuminated by philosophy, we see that early power did not emerge from conflict. It emerged from the need to keep rhythm for a community growing in size and complexity. Power served not to divide, but to connect, not to impose, but to preserve harmony in a world always in motion. A new chapter had begun, yet the voice of the land, the voice of pre-flood ancestors, of Indus towns, of Vedic seekers, still echoed beneath every step. A quiet foundation, ensuring that even as forms changed, the deep rhythm of this place remained unbroken. As the early kingdoms took form across the Ganges plain, another kind of movement began to spread. It was not the movement of chariots or armies, but of ideas. Philosophy stepped out of the forests and left the ritual grounds of the priests, entering the heart of daily life. Rituals expanded beyond noble households and became part of the community's shared rhythm. Power no longer stood apart from knowledge. The two flowed together, along with ritual, like three streams joining into one rising current. Within this atmosphere, centers of thought emerged naturally, as if signaling a new season of change. Kuru Panchala, where Vedic tradition was organized with new clarity. Kosala, where debates carried across generations. Magadha, where geography, minerals, and trade routes created such gravity that merchants and thinkers were drawn in together. What mattered was not the names of these regions, but the feeling that the subcontinent stood before a turning point, a new world forming from layers of memory. Pre-flood intuition, the quiet order of Indus, the cosmic thought of the Vedic age, and the organizing habits of farming and pastoral communities, all of it blended without conflict or erasure. No empire could unify such a vast land. No single lineage could impose its ideas on everyone. The flow of power and knowledge worked instead like the roots of an ancient tree, deep, interwoven, resilient, and never destructive. It was a style shaped by the survival instincts of early communities who learned to bend, not break, when the world changed. In this setting, philosophical questions became part of everyday conversation. People no longer asked only, how do we perform the ritual? But why does the ritual hold the world together? What lies at the foundation of existence? Where do humans stand in an endless cycle of life? What lies behind the surface of things? Ideas once belonging only to the Upanishads began echoing in village gatherings, on trade routes, even in disputes over farmland. Society grew comfortable with thought, and did not see questioning as a threat to tradition, but as a way to deepen understanding. At the same time, the ideas of karma, samsara, moksha became lenses through which people viewed their lives. When the monsoon came late, they examined their own actions. When families moved because the river shifted, they understood it as part of a cycle of transformation. Philosophy did not sit apart from daily life. It entered rice fields, hearths, marketplaces, and became part of a community's breath. Beneath this widening spiritual layer, political power also evolved. As populations grew, as agriculture intensified, and as trade routes crossed tribal borders, leaders had to create systems of coordination. Grain storage, trade regulations, land agreements, shared festivals. Not to impose control, but to prevent chaos. The land still changed with every season, and a more complex society needed a common rhythm to hold together. What is striking is that the early state did not erase tradition. It did not remove rituals or treat philosophy as a threat. Instead, it became the keeper of rhythm, like someone tuning the strings of an instrument so the sound stays true. At the same time, trade opened wider than ever before. Routes stretched from Punjab to Bengal, from the Himalayas to the coasts, from Gujarat to Orissa. Pottery, salt, copper, spices, gemstones, raw silk all moved alongside questions, beliefs, memories, and stories. Each journey was both economic and spiritual exchange. The subcontinent turned into a living network, farmers passing knowledge to merchants, priests sharing teachings with potters, Indu's memory blending with Vedic intuition, and seeds of philosophy taking root across every social layer. All streams, environment, ritual, philosophy, power, trade, were beginning to converge. A new atmosphere gathered, dense, quiet, full of potential. Like the moment before the first thunder of monsoon rolls across the plains, everything felt poised, waiting for a spark, a moment of insight, to ignite the greatest transformation in ancient India. Within an atmosphere where thought, ritual, and power had begun to flow into everyday life, something unusual started to surface. Questions that once murmured faintly across the pre-flood world, that were shaped by the Indus, sharpened in the Vedic age, suddenly rose upright, like young shoots meeting sunlight. They no longer hid behind ritual, no longer stayed sealed inside symbols. They became the voice of the people, a longing to understand the nature of suffering, the cycle of birth and decay, and the deeper reasons behind what makes a person who they are. No dramatic event triggered this shift, no uprising, no season of fire, no collapse. It was simply the ripening of awareness. Over thousands of years, the people of the Ganges plain had watched the world turn through endless cycles. Harvests thriving, then failing, rivers swelling, then retreating, forests opening, then closing, villages growing, then splitting apart. Children grew up, elders passed on, generations layered upon one another. All of this made them realize a quiet truth: nothing lasts. From that realization, one question rose clearly. If everything changes, what is real, and what is only a passing reflection? As the kingdoms of Magadha, Kosala, Vatsa took more defined shape, as trade networks expanded, as society grew heavier with taxes, labor, obligations, and social tiers, that question was no longer reserved for sages in the forest. It entered homes, marketplaces, and casual conversations. People felt themselves swept into a rhythm they had not chosen. From the need for a way forward, a deeper breath, a path out of the relentless turning of life, the desire for transformation began to move. In this setting, two great spiritual movements took root: Buddhism and Jainism. But to understand them, we must look further back, toward the deeper current flowing beneath it all. The ancient awareness of impermanence carried from pre-flood communities, the soft order of the Indus, the inner inquiry of the Upanishads. Both movements arose not as rebellion, but as natural responses to a changing world, one where ritual had grown heavy, priestly authority distant, social hierarchy rigid, and knowledge increasingly locked inside formal structures. People did not want to destroy tradition. They simply wanted room to breathe. And so the first strong voices of awakening rose in Magadha, a fertile land where farmers, merchants, priests, and thinkers crossed paths every day. Here, questions of suffering, rebirth, and liberation became shared questions, not matters reserved for an elite. From this land, a young man stepped forward, Siddhartha Gautama. What is striking is that the Buddha did not appear to overturn tradition. He continued a path long in the making, the inquiry into the self, planted in the Upanishads, an intuition of impermanence shaped by rivers shifting and landscapes changing, the spirit of harmony once central to the Indus, and the simple way of living found in post-Indus communities that needed no towering temples or elaborate rites. In a natural way, centuries of quiet thought gathered into the voice of a prince from Kapilavastu. He did not reject the world. He simply pointed out that suffering is the first truth, and understanding suffering is the first step beyond it. No deity was denied, no tradition extinguished. A new layer of meaning was added. Liberation begins inside, not in ritual. At the same time, Mahavira, the great figure of Jainism, offered a different approach with the same spirit. Freedom comes from disciplining oneself, not from power or possession. That idea found immediate ground in a society longing for something lighter, clearer, and gentler. What is meaningful is that both movements took deepest root in Magadha, a crossroads of Indus memory, Vedic spirit, and agricultural life. In a land that had witnessed impermanence for generations, teachings on non-self, non-violence, and release from the cycle of rebirth felt strangely familiar. No one created Buddhism or Jainism. They emerged as naturally as flowers blooming after a long monsoon. Like the Indus, which never vanished, but merely changed form, these spiritual movements did not dismantle the old foundations. They refined them, removed the weight that had gathered, and kept the purest core. The longing to understand truth, the wish to free oneself from inner knots, belief in impermanence and cycles, reverence for life in all forms. Buddhism and Jainism were not exceptions. They were the crest of a wave. The foundation of that wave was thousands of years of thought rising from the deep. And from the moment these movements blossomed, ancient India entered the broadest age of dialogue in its history, an era in which philosophy no longer lived in books, but in footsteps, in everyday questions, in the breath of a society searching for the true meaning of existence. As spiritual movements like Buddhism and Jainism began spreading along newly opened routes, another phenomenon quietly took shape. Thought itself became a public conversation. No longer confined to forest hermitages, no longer hidden behind the closed doors of ritual, ideas stepped out into everyday life, into places where kings listened, merchants exchanged stories, farmers reflected, and travelers carried teachings farther with each passing day. What's remarkable is that this great dialogue did not rise from conflict, but from the shared need to understand the self after generations living in a world that never stopped changing its shape. People who had grown up watching land, rivers, and winds move in cycles began to see society through the same lens, expanding, contracting, flourishing, tiring, finding order, then falling into disorder. Early kingdoms formed, trade thickened, large villages grew into towns. All of it created the subtle feeling that an era was turning, a chapter where spiritual questions were no longer distant from daily life. In Rajgir, Varanasi, Vaishali, Sarasvati, wherever human footsteps gathered, dialogue unfolded. Temple courtyards at dawn, busy corners of market streets, roadside shelters, caravan rest stops. What is suffering? What is impermanence? What shapes a person's karma? Where does release from weariness lie? There were no boundaries dictating who could speak. Anyone who had seen a river shift its course or lived through a poor harvest had something to add. A quiet but expansive search spread outward, like the smell of earth after the season's first rain. What made this era unique was the response of those in power. In Magadha, rulers recognized that the strength of Buddhism and Jainism did not lie in ritual, but in their ability to ease the anxieties of a rapidly growing society. In Kosala, spiritual councils were invited to advise the court instead of being viewed with suspicion. In Kuru Panchala, Vedic rituals adjusted themselves to a world changing in rhythm. Tradition wasn't broken. It began to breathe again. Meanwhile, merchants became the thread connecting every region. They carried more than salt, pottery, iron, gemstones. They carried ideas. Each journey from the Ganges to the southern coast, from the Himalayas to Gujarat, opened new corridors for thought to travel. With their help, abstract philosophies softened into everyday meaning. Karma became a way to understand choices and consequences. Impermanence helped people accept risk. Liberation evolved into a longing for a place of inner peace in the river of life. Learning centers, the ashramas, appeared more frequently. No longer hidden in deep forests, they settled on the outskirts of growing towns, close enough for anyone to visit, distant enough to preserve stillness. Meditation became a skill anyone could learn. Nonviolence became a way to lighten the heart. Selflessness was no longer a secret doctrine, but a mirror for understanding one's shadows. As these centers linked together, the subcontinent became a many-faceted crystal, each region reflecting its own color, yet together forming a single shared brightness, the glow of a society awakening from within. The most moving change was how people began to view themselves. No longer dust swept along by an endless current. They started to see that they could cross to the far shore through understanding, through ethics, through clarity of mind. That shift subtly rebalanced spiritual power, away from rigid ritual, toward personal insight, away from doctrines, toward self-reflection. This awakening didn't break the old foundation. It made that foundation look inward. Rituals had to rediscover their meaning. Communities reconsidered how to live well. Knowledge sought ways to reach ordinary people. And once the right to ask questions reached every layer of society, the subcontinent entered an age of reflection unlike anything before it. From here, countless small paths began opening toward a vast ocean of thought, like streams branching off from a river overflowing with energy. And from this expanding dialogue, our story moves toward the age of rising Mahajanapadas, a time when Magadha became the axis, and when thought, politics, and daily life did more than blend together. They began to test one another, revealing what could endure across the centuries to come. And at the very moment when ideas reach their widest horizon, our story enters the age when power began gathering into larger shapes. No longer just the gentle Janapadas or early kingdoms feeling their way forward. For the first time in many millennia, the subcontinent saw structures large enough to hold entire regions within a single frame. History calls them empires, but from the long view we have taken, they were not replacements. They were simply the next curve of a familiar cycle, like a river splitting into branches only to find its way back toward one great current. Magadha did not rise from raw ambition. Its ascendance was the result of something slower and deeper. Organizational habits inherited from Indus, the spiritual pulse of the Vedic world, the introspection of the Upanishads, the awakening sparked by Buddhism and Jainism, and the lived wisdom of thousands of years across forests, rivers, and plains. Each era left a tint of its own, and power became the meeting place of all those colors. Magadha was fortunate. Fertile soil, river routes reaching in every direction, crowded trade paths, ideas traveling quickly. But it was only under Ashoka that the empire discovered its most remarkable form, a power capable of looking inward, fearing the shadow of its own might, and bowing before something softer than itself. Ashoka was not born gentle. His path ran through fire, victory, loss, until it reached Kalinga, the point where many of his convictions cracked at once. It wasn't the sight of death that transformed him. It was the feeling of a broken rhythm, the same rhythm his ancestors had guarded since the days of rising seas, shifting rivers, collapsing landscapes, and rituals that once bore the weight of a growing society. All those buried memories seemed to echo up from the deep foundation of history, urging him to stop. And in that pause, he found the teachings of the Buddha: compassion, cause and effect, the letting go of self. Seeds planted long ago across many cultures, now meeting the moment they were meant to bloom. His reign became a rare experiment. Could an empire operate with awareness? Ashoka did not erase tradition or use philosophy as a lever for control. He simply allowed thought to filter through the decisions of the state, like a small lamp set against the wind. The pillars he raised were not displays of dominance. They were quiet reminders that strength does not always need to be hard. It can be soft and lasting, like water sinking into soil, sustaining life longer than any blade of iron. Still, this age was never the story of one man alone. As the empire expanded, as trade became its bloodstream, ideas also had to learn how to live inside a new reality. Buddhism grew into many branches, some introspective, some philosophical. Jainism widened its monastic communities. Vedic tradition lightened itself by reshaping rituals to match a changing society. No tradition swallowed another. Each adapted without losing its origin. This was the meeting of two forces: the soft force of the spirit, the wide force of political power. Neither force destroyed the other. They leaned on each other to go farther. Power needed thought to keep hearts steady. Thought needed power to cross borders. Like sunlight falling on water, giving shape, yet shimmering because of the water's movement. Through merchant routes, crossing hills and rivers, India sent its spirit outward for the first time. Not through conquest, but through ideas. From Afghanistan to Sri Lanka, from Myanmar to the Greco-Bactrian world, teachings on impermanence, cause and effect, release, and compassion traveled as the inner luggage of those who journeyed. A form of expansion not driven by drums of war, but by the human need to understand life. As ideas moved farther, the empire itself also began to shift. No empire stands forever. What remains is not palaces or victories worn down by monsoon and time, but the spiritual sediments each era leaves behind. Ways of seeing the cycle of life, of action, of responsibility, of bending without breaking. These layers continued shaping later centuries, like groundwater feeding the land through dry seasons. And now, as all the currents, pre-flood memory, Indus order, Vedic rhythm, Upanishadic insight, Buddhist compassion, early kingdoms, rising empires, begin to merge, we approach the final stretch, the moment when the deepest identity of ancient India comes into view. Not as a conclusion, but as the long breath of a world that learned to survive countless transformations. And when the last great empires softened under the light of time, when Ashoka's inscriptions faded under countless seasons of monsoon rain, when the trade routes that once tied the subcontinent together became only distant echoes in memory, our story, too, reaches the place where it settles into a natural close. Not a close like a heavy door shutting, but like a lake calming after a passing breeze, still again, yet carrying a faint tremor from the wave that just moved through. Because history never ends. It simply changes the voice that tells it. If we look back across the entire journey we've traveled, from the prehistoric migrations that followed ancient shorelines off Gujarat, from the drowned edge of Sunda, from the grasslands of Doggerland, swallowed by rising seas, from the disciplined rhythms of the Indus, from the great villages of the Ganges plain, to the kingdoms, and finally the empires, we begin to see that the essence of a civilization does not lie in its brightest moment, but in the silent motion that led toward that moment. For ancient India, that motion had no name. It did not belong to a single people, did not begin with a single doctrine, did not rise from the prestige of any dynasty. It was the quiet footstep of countless lives passing over soft soil, coastal families watching the post-glacial sea rise, Indus potters leaning toward their kilns, Vedic priests reading starlight reflected on damp earth, the Buddha walking barefoot along the dusty roads of Magadha, merchants carrying both faith and doubt along the long routes of forest, river, and coast. None of them knew they were weaving a vast tapestry. They simply lived according to a natural rhythm, slow, steady, unforced. And within that simplicity, something extraordinary formed, a capacity to absorb what was new, soften it, transform it, without losing its roots. That is why this land so rarely breaks in an absolute sense. Empires fall, traditions branch, communities reshape themselves, yet nothing vanishes entirely. Everything blends, like water, meeting water within a wide riverbed, quietly becoming a new stream. No rupture, only transition. If we trace the spiritual map of the subcontinent, we do not find straight lines. We find arcs, spirals, flowing curves, tributaries splitting and merging. Not disorder, but the ancient art of flexibility, the ability to let the world pass through without being overturned. Even at the Mauryan peak, thought was never locked down. Rituals grew lighter, philosophy grew wider. Buddhism and Jainism spread without erasing the older ground. Ashoka seemed to understand something many civilizations took far longer to learn. That durable power does not come from hardness, but from the ability to step back and allow the world to find its own rhythm. That was the spirit of the Indus. That was the instinct of prehistoric communities watching the sea rise. That was the breath of the subcontinent, listening to nature rather than fighting it. When we view the entire arc, from pre-sea level change to the age of spiritual emperors, each era becomes only a doorway into the next. There is no final part, no permanent answer, only a long current stretching across tens of thousands of years. Humanity trying to understand the world, then learning to release what lies beyond its reach. And perhaps this is the quietest, deepest message the journey leaves behind. We are not outside the current. We are part of it. The earliest communities of the subcontinent did not seek immortality. They sought a way of living that moved in rhythm with the sky above and the soil beneath. Something still true in the modern age, as humanity again faces changes faster than the rivers of old ever change their courses. And perhaps, if one evening we stand at the water's edge, watching a lake turn gold under a fading sun, we may sense what the ancients once sensed, that every civilization, bright or distant, is only one passing shape of water, not lost, not still, only changing form and continuing to flow. Our story pauses here, not because history has run dry, but because the breath of this journey has come full circle. And even as this page closes, that nameless current remains, deep, wide, quiet, like the memory of an ancient India that never truly left the world.